Analysis of a case of obsessional neurosis. Sigmund Freud. Analysis of a case of obsessive neurosis, case of the rat man. Introduction. The following pages contain two things. Firstly, fragmentary data on the clinical history of a case of obsessive neurosis, which due to its duration and its consequences, and according to my subjective appreciation, should be included among those of a certain severity and whose treatment, prolonged through a whole year, he was able to completely reconstruct the personality and suppress the inhibitions. And secondly, linked to this case and to others previously analyzed, some aphoristic observations on the genesis and mechanism of obsessive mental processes, intended to continue and expand my first studies on the subject, published in 1896. I believe it is essential to justify such index so that it is not supposed that I consider such a fragmentary exposition of a clinical case perfect and worthy of imitation when in reality it is imposed on me by extrinsic and intrinsic considerations, and I would of course have been more explicit if I could have. But it is not possible for me to communicate the complete history of the treatment, because that would force me to reveal in detail the personal circumstances of my patient. The intrusive attention that a whole large city devotes to my medical activity prevents me from developing an exact and meticulous exposition, and on the other hand, the distortions with which an attempt is made to forget such an inconvenience have always seemed to me as inappropriate as they were rejectable. Limited, they do not achieve their purpose of protecting the patient from indiscreet curiosity, and if we take them further, they are too expensive, since they make it impossible to understand the case, stealing from the reader's knowledge fundamental relationships linked precisely to the small realities of the patient's life. Sick. It is, therefore, paradoxically more lawful to publicize the most intimate secrets of a patient, by which it is not easy to identify him, than to the most innocent and trivial circumstances of his personality, known to all and which will discover him instantly. Thus justifying the ungrateful mutilation of the patient's records and their treatment, the fact that my exposition appears limited to fractional results of the psychoanalytic investigation of obsessional neurosis has an even clearer and more convincing explanation. I must admit, in fact, that I have not yet been able to unravel without any residue the complicated structure of a severe case of obsessional neurosis, and also that it would not be possible for me to demonstrate through the layers of the treatment and with the detailed exposition of the analysis, such a structure. Analytically discovered, or suspected, since the resistance of the patients and the way in which they express themselves make such expository work extremely difficult. But, in addition, it must be taken into account that the understanding of an obsessional neurosis is certainly not easy and certainly much more difficult than that of a case of hysteria. At first sight we would rather be inclined to assume the opposite. The set of means that obsessional neurosis uses to exteriorize its secret ideas, that is, the language of obsessional neurosis is like a dialect that should be more intelligible to us because it is more akin than hysterics to the expression of our conscious thought. First of all, it does not integrate that jump from the psychic to the somatic innervation - the hysterical conversion, which our intellect can never second. The fact that reality does not confirm the aforementioned hypothesis depends perhaps only on our lesser knowledge of obsessive neurosis. Severe obsessional neurotics seek psychoanalytic treatment in far fewer numbers than hysterics. They hide their pathological states in social life as long as possible and only turn to the doctor in very advanced stages of their disease, stages such as those that in tuberculosis already exclude admission to a sanatorium. We have chosen this comparison because in obsessional neurosis, severe or mild, but combated early, one can point out, as in that other chronic infectious disease, a whole series of brilliant healing successes. In such circumstances there is no other possibility than to communicate things as imperfectly and incompletely as we know them and can make them public. The painstakingly mined bits of knowledge we offer here might seem unsatisfactory, but the work of other researchers will be linked to them, and the common effort will be able to achieve what is perhaps too arduous for one alone. Medical history. A young man, with a university education, comes to my office stating that he has been suffering from obsessive representations since childhood, but with particular intensity since 4 years ago. The main content of his ailment was the fear that something would happen to the two people he loved the most, his mother and the lady of his thoughts. He also felt obsessive impulses, such as cutting his throat with a razor, and he imposed prohibitions that also extended to trivial and indifferent things. The fight against his obsessive ideas had made him waste a lot of time, slowing him down in his career. Of all the treatments tried, only one had given him some relief, a hydrotherapy treatment in a spa, but only because during his stay there he found an opportunity to engage in regular sexual activity. Here in Vienna no such opportunity offered him, and he cohabited only rarely and at long intervals. Prostitutes disgusted him. In general, their sex life had been very limited. Onanism had played very little part in her, and then only when she was 16 or 17. His potency was normal, and until he was 26 he had not known a woman. The patient gave the impression of being a man of clear and penetrating intelligence. Asked why he began the anamnesis with reports on his sexual life, he explains that he did so because he knew that this was the case with my theories. Nor has he read any of my works, and only very recently, when leafing through one of them, did he find the explanation of certain verbal associations that reminded him of the mental elaboration to which he himself submitted his ideas, and they decided to come to my office. Initiation of treatment. The next day, once committed to observing the only condition of the treatment, that is, to communicate everything that came into his mind, even if it was unpleasant for him to talk about it or it seemed trivial, incoherent, or nonsensical, and having left at his discretion, the choice of the initial theme of his story began with the following: he has a friend whom he esteems very much. Whenever he is tormented by a criminal impulse, he goes to him and asks if he despises him as a criminal. The friend encourages him, assuring him that he is an irreproachable man, subject only from his youth to analyzing his actions with fearful unfounded scruples. A similar influence had been exerted on him before by another person, a student who was 19 when he was 14 or 15, and whose esteem elevated his opinion of himself to the point that he almost believed himself a genius. That student then went on to give him private lessons, and then he changed his attitude towards him abruptly, making him understand that he was useless. Finally he realized that if he had shown him sympathy before, it had only been to achieve his friendship and to be welcomed into his home, since he was in love with one of his sisters. This was the first serious disappointment of his life. Child sexuality. My sexuality was very early. I remember a scene that had to take place when I was 4 to 5 years old. From the age of 6 I already have a clear and precise memory of my life. And that arose in my memory years later. We had a pretty young governess, Fräulein Peter. And one night when I was reading, stretched out on a sofa and scantily dressed, I asked her permission to get under her skirts, leaving her on the condition that I tell no one. He had little clothing on, and I was able to touch his genitals and his entire body without difficulty, which seemed singularly shaped to me. Since then I have been left with a burning curiosity to contemplate the female body. I still remember how eagerly I expected the governess to undress when we went to bathe, for I was still allowed to go on such occasions with her and my sisters. Other more detailed memories of this genre are already after I was 6 years old. We then had another governess, also young and pretty, who suffered from abscesses on her buttocks and cured them when she went to bed, a moment that I waited for with impatience to satisfy my curiosity. And the same in the bathroom, even though Fräulein Lena was more modest than the other. To 1. My question, he answers that he usually did not sleep in the governess's room, but in his parents' room. I also remember another scene that must have taken place when I was about 7 years old. One afternoon when the governess, a cook, a maid, a little brother of mine, a year and a half younger, and I were together, I heard Fräulein Lena say to the other girls, "With the little one it could be done, but Pablo, he is very clumsy and would probably miss the mark." I did not clearly understand what it was about, but I did understand that my brother was being postponed, and I began to cry. Lena consoled me and told me that a girl who had done that with the child entrusted to her custody had gone to jail for a few months. I don't think Lena ever did anything illegal with me, but she did allow me to take great liberties with her. When she was in bed, I would come to her bed and uncover her and touch her without her protesting. He is not very intelligent and he is very sexual. At 23 she had already had a son, whose father later married her. I still see her sometimes on the street. At the age of 6 I already had frequent erections, and I remember having once complained to my mother about the discomfort they caused me, although not without a certain fear, since I suspected the relationship of this phenomenon with my imagination and my curiosity and was worried about the idea morbid that my parents knew my intimate thoughts because I had revealed them out loud myself without realizing it. I see here the beginning of my illness. There were girls that I liked very much and whom I ardently wanted to see naked, but such desires were accompanied by a feeling of uneasiness, as if something were going to happen by thinking these things and I had to do everything possible to avoid it. When questioned by me, he points to the death of his father as an example of such fears. The idea of my father's death troubled me from an early age and for a long time, causing me great sadness. At this point I learn, to my surprise, that the subject's father, to whom the obsessive fears that torment him still refer, has died several years ago. Those events of his 6 or 7 years that our patient describes to us in the first session of treatment are not only the beginning of his illness, but the illness itself, a complete obsessional neurosis, which does not lack any essential element and which it is, at the same time, the nodule and the prototype of the subsequent suffering, constituting the elementary organism, whose study is the only means that can clarify for us the complicated structure of the current disease. We see the boy under the control of one of the components of the sexual instinct, visual pleasure, the result of which is the desire, always emerging again with great intensity, to see the feminine persons he likes naked. This desire corresponds to the ulterior obsessive idea, and if it does not yet entail an obsessive character, it is because the ego has not yet placed itself in open contradiction with it and does not feel it as something alien to itself, but it already starts, without that we know where it comes from, an opposition to such a desire, since a painful affect regularly accompanies its appearance. In the mental life of the little voluptuous there is a conflict. Along with the obsessive desire there is an obsessive fear intimately linked to it. Whenever the subject thinks something related to his desire, the fear arises in him that something terrible is going to happen, and this something already has a characteristic indeterminacy that is always concomitant with the manifestations of neurosis. But in the child it is not difficult to discover what such indeterminacy conceals. If we succeed in finding a detail in which one of the vague generalities of obsessional neurosis has been concentrated, we can be sure that this detail contains the original and authentic element that should be covered by the generalization. The obsessive fear was, then, in this case, reconstructed according to its meaning, the following: if I have the desire to see a woman naked, my father will die. The painful affect clearly takes on a disturbing and superstitious nuance and already gives rise to impulses tending to do something to ward off the misfortune, such as will later be imposed in subsequent protective measures. We find, then, an erotic instinct and a rebellion against itself, a desire, not yet obsessive, and a contrary fear, already obsessive, a painful affection and an impulse to adopt defensive measures, that is, the complete inventory of neurosis. And something else still, a kind of delusion or mania of singular content, according to which his parents knew his most intimate thoughts, because he himself revealed them aloud without realizing it. We will hardly make a mistake in considering this childish attempt at an explanation as a presentiment of those unique mental processes that we call unconscious, and which we cannot do without to clarify such an obscure state of affairs. The words "I reveal my thoughts aloud without realizing it" sound like an outward projection of our own hypothesis that the subject carries thoughts of which he knows nothing, that is, as an endopsychic perception of the repressed. We clearly see that this elementary and infantile neurosis already contains its problem and appears absurd, like any complicated adult neurosis. What can it mean that the father has to die if that voluptuous desire is promoted in the child? Is it sheer nonsense, or are there ways to understand such a statement and apprehend it as a necessary result of previous processes and premises? Applying to this case of infantile neurosis knowledge obtained in others, we must assume that here too, that is, prior to the age of 6, there have been traumatic events, conflicts, and repressions that have later succumbed to amnesia, but leaving that content of obsessive fear as residue. We shall see later to what extent it is possible for us to rediscover such forgotten events or to reconstruct them with any certainty. But in the meantime, we will have to point out as a coincidence that it is probably not indifferent that our patient's childhood amnesia ends precisely at the age of 6. Such a beginning of a chronic obsessional neurosis with such voluptuous desires, to which disturbing fears and a tendency to perform defensive acts are linked, is already known to us from other cases. It is totally typical, although it is probably not the only type. We will dedicate a few more words to the patient's early sexual experiences, before moving on to the content of the second treatment session. One cannot help but consider such experiences as especially rich in content and effectiveness. But the same thing happens, exactly, in all the other cases of obsessional neurosis that I have analyzed. Contrary to what happens in hysteria, premature sexual activity is never lacking in them. Obsessive neurosis reveals, much more clearly than hysteria, how the factors that make up psychoneuroses should not be sought in current sexual life, but in childhood. The current sexual life of obsessional neurotics can often appear, to a superficial observer, absolutely normal, since it frequently offers fewer pathogenic factors and fewer abnormalities than that of our patient. The great obsessive fear. I will start today with the event that decided me to go to your office. It was in August, and I was in X, doing my annual tour of duty as a reservist. I had been feeling very depressed and tormented myself with all kinds of obsessive ideas, which later disappeared during the maneuvers. I was interested in showing the officers that one was not only a man of study, but also a good soldier capable of withstanding the fatigues of military life. One day we made a not very long march starting from X. During a break I lost my glasses, and although it would not have been easy for me to find them by looking for them in some detail, I gave it up, not wanting to delay the departure, and I telegraphed my optician in Vienna to send me others. During the same break I had been sitting between two officers, one of whom, a captain with a Czech name, was to become of great importance to me. This fellow inspired me with a certain fear, for he was manifestly inclined to cruelty. I do not want to say that he was a villain, but in his conversations he had repeatedly been in favor of corporal punishment, and I had several times hotly contested his opinion. During this break we started talking again, and the captain told of having read that a singularly frightful punishment was applied in the East. Arriving here, the patient stopped, and getting up from the divan on which he was lying, he asked me to excuse him from the description of that punishment. I assured him that, for my part, I had no tendency to be cruel, and that I certainly did not want to torment him, but that I could not grant him what he asked of me, since overcoming resistance was an inescapable mandate to the priest. At the beginning of that session I had explained the concept of resistance, when he warned me how much he had to force himself to communicate that experience to me. Then I continued by telling him that I would do my best to facilitate the task, trying to guess what he would simply indicate, without going into details, and I asked him if he was referring to impalement. No, it's not that. The condemned man was tied up. He expressed himself so imprecisely that I could not guess in what position at the moment. A container was fitted to his buttocks and a few rats were put into it, which then. He had gotten up again and was showing signs of maximum effort and resistance. A few rats, which were later getting into him. Here I was able to complete, through the anus. At all the important moments in the story, a singularly composed physiognomic expression could be observed in him, which could only be interpreted as a sign of horror at a pleasure of which he was not in the least aware. With difficulty he continued, At that very moment the idea arose in me that this was happening to a person who was dear to me. When questioned, he pointed out that the idea was not that he applied such a punishment, but rather that it was applied impersonally to the evoked person. After a brief reflection, I concluded that said person could not be other than the lady to whom the subject was dedicating his attentions at that time. At this point the patient interrupted his story to show me how alien and opposed to his true personality such thoughts were, and with what extraordinary rapidity everything connected with them developed in him. Simultaneously, the idea always arose the sanction, that is, the defense measure that had to be put into practice so that the fantasy did not come true. When the captain spoke of that horrible punishment and the ideas he had mentioned arose in the subject, he still managed to defend himself against both with his usual incantation, consisting of a gesture of revulsion and the exclamation, "What nonsense are you thinking of?" The plural both must have surprised me, as it will doubtless have surprised the reader, since the patient had only mentioned one, that the torment of rats was applied to the mistress of his thoughts. But now he had to confess that simultaneously with this idea the idea that the torment extended to his father had also arisen. But since his father had died many years before, the obsessive fear was even more senseless than the first, and he tried to remain unconfessed. The next day, the same captain handed him a postal package and told him, "Lieutenant A has paid the reimbursement for you. You have to give him the money." The package contained the glasses ordered by telegraph from Vienna. At the same moment a sanction arose in him: "I will not return the money, because if I did, that would happen, the fantasy of the rats would come true in his father and in the lady." And in accordance with the typical trajectory already in him, a mandate in the form of an oath was immediately raised to combat such a sanction: "You have to return the 3.80 crowns to Lieutenant A," words that he uttered almost in a low voice. The military exercises ended 2 days later. During them, the subject made continuous efforts to repay Lieutenant A the small amount owed, against which difficulties of an apparently objective nature arose time and again. At first he tried to make the payment through another official who went to the post office, but he was very happy when he himself returned the money, claiming that he had not found Lieutenant A in the post offices, since that way of fulfilling his oath did not satisfy him because it did not correspond to the liberal form of it: "You have to return the 3.80 crowns to Lieutenant A." At last he found the latter, but the officer refused to accept the money, saying that he had not paid anything on his own, he was not even in charge of the mail, a function that corresponded to Lieutenant B. The subject was somewhat perplexed, seeing the impossibility of fulfilling his oath, for one of his assumptions might be wrong, and he imagined a whole series of complicated expedients. He would go to the post office with Lieutenants A and B, and the first would give the person in charge of the postal parcel service 3.80 crowns, which the employee would deliver to B, and then he could fulfill his oath to the letter by giving the 3.80 crowns to A. I will not be surprised if the reader finds all this incomprehensible, since the patient's detailed description of the external events of these days and his reactions to them also suffered from internal contradictions and seemed inexplicably confused. Only in a third story did I manage to make him notice such inaccuracies and determine the mnemonic errors and displacements he had incurred. But we can save ourselves from reproducing these details, the essential part of which will occupy us later, and limit ourselves to indicating that at the end of this second session the subject behaved as if dazed and alienated, repeatedly calling me my captain, no doubt because at the beginning of the session had told him that I was not a cruel man like the captain in his story and I had no intention of tormenting him unnecessarily. In this session he also explained to me that from the beginning, and already in the primitive fears that something would happen to the people of his particular affection, he had located such punishments not only in the temporal, but also in eternity in the afterlife. Until the age of 14 or 15 he had been very religious, since then evolving into his present disbelief. The contradiction that thus arose between her current convictions and the acceptance of an afterlife saved her by saying, "What do you know about life in the afterlife? And what do the others know? You can't know anything, and therefore you risk nothing by thinking like this." The subject, a man of otherwise acute and clear intelligence, considered such a conclusion irreproachable and took advantage of the insecurity of human reason in such a problem in favor of his previous pious conception of the universe, now superseded. In the third session he completed the very characteristic account of his efforts to fulfill his obsessive oath. In the evening the last meeting of the officers was held before the end of the military period. It was his turn to answer the toast dedicated to the gentlemen reservists, and he spoke eloquently, but like a sleepwalker, because deep down he was still tormented by his oath. The night was awful. Arguments and counter-arguments rattled in his brain. The main argument was, of course, that the fundamental premise of his oath had been proven wrong, since Lieutenant A had not paid any money for it. But he consoled himself by thinking what A would do with them, up to date. Next, a part of the march to the railway station of P, and he could give him the money, begging him to give it to B. When the time came, he did not do it and let P go. A, without saying anything, commissioning, instead, his assistant to announce his visit for that same afternoon. For his part, he arrived at the station at 9:30 in the morning, left his luggage in the locker and evacuated various matters in the small town, always with the purpose of making his announced visit to A. The village where A was stationed was an hour's drive from P. The railway journey to the town where the post office was located took 3 hours. He believed, therefore, that it would be possible for him to reach, once taken carried out his complicated plan, the last train leaving P for Vienna. The ideas that were at stake in him were the following: on the one hand, that if he had not just decided to fulfill his oath, it was out of sheer cowardice, since he wanted to save himself the trouble of requesting that service from A and appearing before him as a disturbed person. And on the other, that the cowardice was precisely in fulfilling the oath, since with this he only intended to free himself from his obsessive ideas. When in a reflection his arguments were counterbalanced in this way, the subject used to abandon himself to chance, and thus, when a waiter at the station asked him if he was going to take the 10 o'clock train, he answered affirmatively and left on said train, creating a fait accompli that relieved him greatly. As the employee of the dining car passed by, he asked her to reserve a place for him for lunch, but already at the first station it occurred to him that he could still get off there, take a train in the opposite direction to the town where A was, make the 3-hour trip with him to the post office, etc. Only the commission given to the employee of the dining car kept him from putting this purpose into practice, but he did not renounce it completely, but rather postponed it from station to station until he reached a station where he could not get off because he had relatives in the locality to which it corresponded, and then he decided to continue his journey to Vienna, look for his friend, put the matter to him, and in any case return to P on the night train. Faced with my doubts that it would have been possible for him to carry out such a plan, he assured me that he would have had half an hour between the arrival of his train and the departure of the other. But when he arrived in Vienna, he did not find his friend in the beer hall where he expected to find him, and already at 11 o'clock at night he saw him at his house and told him of his perplexity. The friend expressed astonishment that he still doubted that it was an obsessive idea. He reassured him for that night, during which he slept without anguish, and the next morning he accompanied him to the post office, where he imposed a transfer of 3.80 crowns addressed to the post offices that had received the package with the glasses. These last details provided me with a point of support to unravel the distortions of his story. If, when called to reason by his friend, he had not already transferred the small sum to Lieutenant A nor to Lieutenant B, but directly to the post office, he must have known and should have already known before his departure that only to the post office employee, and no one else, owed the amount of the refund. And, indeed, it turned out that he knew this before the captain's warning and his oath, for now he remembered that hours before his encounter with the cruel captain he had spoken with another captain, who had explained to him the true state of affairs. The latter officer, learning his name, had told him that he had been at the post office, where the clerk had asked him if he knew a certain Lieutenant H. R. patient, for whom a postal package had just arrived against refund. The officer had replied in the negative, but the employee had stated that she trusted the honor of that unknown lieutenant and would advance the amount of the reimbursement. In this way the glasses he had ordered by telegraph came into the possession of our patient. The cruel captain was wrong to warn him, when he handed over the package, that he should give the 3.80 crowns to A. Our patient must have known that this was a mistake, and yet he made, on the basis of that mistake, an oath that was to torment him. In doing so, and later in his account of such events, he hid from himself and from me the episode of the other captain and the existence of the kind post office employee. In any case, I recognize that after this rectification, his conduct still becomes more senseless and incomprehensible to us than before. When he separated from his friend and returned to his house, his doubts returned to torment him. His friend's arguments had been none other than his own, and he saw very well that if they had temporarily reassured him, it was only because of his own personal influence. The decision to consult a doctor was woven into the delirium in the following ingenious way: he would have a doctor give a certificate that for his recovery it was necessary for him to carry out, with Lieutenant A, that series of acts that he had projected, and surely such a certificate would move the officer to accept from him the 3.80 crowns. The chance that a book of mine fell into his hands at that time directed his choice towards me. But understanding that he was not to obtain such a certificate from me, he only asked me, very reasonably, to free him from his obsessive ideas. Many months later, at the height of his resistance, he was once again tempted to go to P, find Lieutenant A, and perform the comedy of returning the money with him. Introduction on the nature of the cure. One should not expect to immediately find an explanation for such singularly absurd obsessive ideas, that of the torment of rats. The psychoanalytic technique obliges the doctor to repress his curiosity, and allow the patient to set the order of succession of the topics in the analysis with full freedom. Therefore in the fourth session I received the patient with the question, "How are you going to continue today?" "I have decided to tell you something that seems very important to me and that torments me from the beginning," he replied. And he began to develop, with meticulous length, the clinical history of his father, who died 9 years ago as a result of emphysema. One night, believing that his father's illness could make a favorable crisis, he asked the doctor when the danger could be considered over. The doctor replied that after 48 hours. It did not occur to him that his father could die before that term, and at 11:30 he went to bed to sleep for an hour. But when he woke up at 1 o'clock, a doctor friend told him that his father had just died. The subject reproached himself for not having been by his father's side at the time of death, and even harsher when the nurse told him that the patient had called his name before, and when she approached him she had asked him, "Are you Pablo?" He thought he noticed that his mother and sisters were making a similar reproach, but they did not speak of it. The reproach was not very painful at first, since the subject did not accept his father's death as a fact for a long time, and so it happened time and time again that, for example, when he heard some funny joke, he said to himself, "I have to tell Dad." Also in her fantasy, her father was still alive, in such a way that many times, when she heard a knock on the door, she would think, "There is Daddy," and when she entered a room she expected to find him there, and although he never forgot the fact of his death, the expectation of such apparitions was not fearful at all, but much desired. Only a year and a half later did the memory of his negligence awaken in him, and he began to cruelly torment him, making him consider himself heartless. The revival of that memory was provoked by the death of one of her married aunts and her condolence visit to her husband. From that moment he added to his imaginations that of the afterlife. The first consequence of this access was a serious disability for work. As the subject affirmed that he had only been sustained at that time by the consolation of his friend, who made him see the senseless exaggeration of his reproaches, I took advantage of the occasion to give him a first insight into the premises of psychoanalytic therapy. When there is a disparity between the ideological content and the affect, that is, between the magnitude of the reproach and its cause, the layman would say that the affect was too intense, exaggerated, therefore, and consequently false, the conclusion of being a criminal, deducted from the reproach. The doctor, on the contrary, says, no, the affect is justified, and there is no reason to criticize the guilty conscience that torments the subject, but this corresponds to another unknown content, unconscious, and that must be sought first. The known ideological content has come to occupy such a place due to an erroneous association. But we are not used to feeling intense affections without ideological content, and therefore, when such content is lacking, we resort to any other, adequate, surrogate. The fact of the false association is also the only thing that can explain the impotence of all logical work against painful representation. We will conclude with the confession that this theory initially poses great problems, since the subject could not justify his reproach of having committed a crime against his father if he knew perfectly well that he had never been guilty of anything against him. In the following session, he showed great interest in my explanations, although he allowed himself to express some doubts about them. How could the statement that blame and guilt were justified have a therapeutic effect? It was not such an affirmation that produced this effect, but the discovery of the unknown content, to which the reproach corresponded. Yes, but that was precisely what he was referring to in his question. I explained to him the slight indications that I had given him about the psychological differences between the conscious and the unconscious and about the deterioration to which everything conscious is subjected, while the unconscious remains relatively unchanged, using a comparison with the antiquities that decorated my cabinet in consultation. They had been discovered in some excavations, and they owed their preservation to the fact that they had remained buried. Only after it had been discovered was Pompeii in danger of falling into ruin. He then asked if there was any general rule that would regulate the conduct of patients in the face of what was discovered. In his opinion, some would dominate the reproach and others would not. Nothing of that. It was in the very nature of the circumstances that the affect was already dominated during the analytic work in most cases. Just as they tried to preserve Pompeii, the sick always tried to free themselves from such ideas. It had been said that a reproach could only arise for the transgression of the most intimately personal moral laws, and not for the external ones. For my part, I confirmed his opinion on this point, adding that whoever only breaks external rules is often considered a hero. Such a process would be, then, only possible given a pre-existing dissociation of personality. Would he be able to restore the unity of his? If he succeeded, he would feel capable of anything but ordinary returns. There was, of course, a dissociation of the personality, but he had to merge this new antithesis, announced by him, between the moral person and evil, with that other one that we had spoken of before, between the conscious and the unconscious. The moral person would be the conscious and evil the unconscious. He remembered that, despite considering himself a moral person, in his childhood he had carried out things emanating from the other person. With such an observation I told him he had discovered, without intending it, one of the main characteristics of the unconscious, its relationship with the infantile. The unconscious was the infantile and precisely that part of the person that at that time was separated from her, not accompanying her in the rest of the evolution and thus being repressed. The ramifications of this repressed unconscious were the elements that maintained that involuntary mental labor, in which his ailment consisted. Now he could also discover for himself another character of the unconscious. He finds nothing more, and, instead, expresses the doubt that alterations that have existed for so long can be annulled. What could be done, for example, against the idea of the afterlife, impossible to logically contest. For my part, I did not deny the seriousness of his case and the importance of his mental constructions, but his age was very favorable, as was the intactness of his personality. In this connection, I expressed a favorable opinion of him, which visibly satisfied him. In the following session, he began by telling me that he was going to tell me something pertaining to his childhood. As he had already told me, at the age of 7 he was tormented by the fearful worry that his parents were guessing his thoughts, a worry which, in fact, had not entirely dissipated in later life. At the age of 12 he had fallen in love with a girl, the sister of a friend, non-sexual infatuation, since he did not want to see her naked, perhaps because she was too young, but she was not as affectionate with him as he would have liked. Then the idea occurred to him that if a misfortune happened to her, the girl would treat him with greater tenderness, and as such the death of her father immediately arose in her imagination. The childish subject immediately rejected such an idea with all his energy, and even today he defends himself against the possibility of having conceived such a desire, arguing that, in any case, it would have been a mere mental association. For my part, I object that if it hadn't been a wish, then I had no reason to blame him. Because of the very content of the representation, that is, that his father could die. I considered, then, I replied, that idea with the same criteria that the authorities apply, as is generally known, to verbal offenses against the sovereign, punishing the individual who says, "The emperor is an ass," who at the same time who disguises the insult by saying, "If someone says that the emperor is an ass, he will have to deal with me." He could present to him the very idea that motivated his reproaches related to something that excluded them at all, for example, "If my father dies, I will commit suicide next to his grave." This explanation seems essential, but without making him renounce his contradiction. I therefore opted to abandon the discussion, pointing out that the idea of the father's death must not have arisen for the first time in his thoughts on that occasion, but that it obviously came from a long way back, and we would have to investigate its origin later. Origin. He continues his story by stating that 6 months before his father's death an almost identical idea had rapidly crossed his mind. At that time he was already in love with the aforementioned lady, but it was impossible for him to think of marrying her because of obstacles of a material order. Then his idea had been that the death of his father would make him rich, allowing him to marry his beloved. His revulsion against such an idea was so violent that he even wished that his father would not leave the slightest fortune, so that nothing could compensate him for such a terrible loss. The same idea, though more subdued, arose for the third time on the eve of his father's death. He thought, in effect, that he was about to lose what he loved most, and immediately the contradictory idea arose, "No, there is still another person whose death would be more painful for you." The subject was very surprised by such thoughts, since he was completely sure that the death of his father could never have been the content of a desire, and only that of a fear. After this argument, expressed with all its energy, I consider it opportune to present to you a new fragment of psychoanalytic theory. It affirms that such anguish corresponds to a past and now repressed desire, therefore having to accept precisely the opposite of what it seems to accentuate. This also coincides with the theoretical statement that the unconscious must be the contradictory antithesis of the conscious. The subject is very impressionable, but also very incredulous, and it is very strange that this desire could have arisen in him when his father was precisely the person who inspired him the most. There was no doubt that he would have gladly renounced all personal happiness if he could have prolonged his life with it. I reply that precisely such intense affection is the necessary condition of repressed hatred. If he were an indifferent person, it would be easy for him to keep the motives of moderate inclination and moderate deviation juxtaposed. For example, if you were an employee and you thought your boss was a very nice superior, but a bad lawyer and an inhumane judge. Brutus says something like this, referring to Caesar, in the Shakespearean play, 3:2 Because Caesar loved me, I cry for him, because he was courageous, I honor him, but because he was a tyrant, I have killed him. And these words produce a strange impression on us, because we had thought Brutus's affection for Caesar was more intense. In the case of a more beloved person, for example, his wife, he would have aspired to give unity to his feelings, and, consequently, as humanly happens in general, he would have closed his eyes to those faults that could cause his lack of love. Thus, precisely a very intense love does not allow hatred, which must have some source, to remain conscious. In his case, it was, of course, a problem to find out the origin of that hatred, but its very manifestations clearly indicated as the time of its appearance the one in which he had feared that his parents would guess his thoughts. On the other hand, one could also wonder why his intense affection had not been able to extinguish the hatred, as usually happens when two opposite impulses are confronted. It could only be assumed that the hatred was linked to a source, to a motive, which made it indestructible. Thus, on the one hand, such a relationship prevented the hatred against the father from being destroyed by affection, and, on the other, affection prevented the hatred from becoming conscious, so that only one path remained for hatred, to follow subsisting in the unconscious, from which it was possible, however, to quickly escape at times. Subject concedes that this all seems very plausible to him, but, naturally, without the slightest real conviction, he is going to allow me to ask how it is that such an idea can make such long pauses, appearing for the first time when he was 12, then when he was already 20, and, for the last and third time, 2 years later, having not reappeared since. He could not believe that in the intervals the hostility against his father had died down, and yet during them he had not been tormented by reproaches. To this question I answer that when someone asks it, it is because they have already prepared the answer. Just let him keep talking. The subject continues, then without apparently linking his words to the immediately preceding ones stating that he had always been his father's best friend, like his father, agreeing on everything, except on some topic that they avoided. Talk, in such a way that the intimacy that had reigned between them far exceeded the one that now presided over relations with his best friend. That lady, to whom he had proposed to his father, when he thought of the pain that her death would cause him, inspired him with intense affection, but he had never felt towards her truly sensual desires, such as those that filled his childhood. His sensual impulses had generally been much stronger during his childhood than at the time of puberty. I point out to him that he has already given the answer we expected, discovering with it the third main character of the unconscious. The source from which he drew his hostility against his father, his indestructibility, was evidently connected with sensual desires, for the satisfaction of which he would have seen in his father in some way a hindrance. Such a conflict between sensuality and filial love is absolutely typical. The pauses to which he had previously alluded were due to the fact that the early explosion of his sensuality had brought with it, as a first consequence, a calming down of it. Only when intense amorous desires had arisen in him again, had hostility resurfaced, by constituting a similar situation. Lastly, I ask him to confirm that I had not oriented him towards the sexual theme, but rather that he was the one who spontaneously entered this area. The subject now asks why, at the time of his falling in love with that lady, he did not simply decide, for his government, that an opposition from his father would never diminish her affection for him in any way. I reply that it is very difficult to destroy someone who is absent, and that such a decision would only have been possible if the reprehensible desire had arisen in him for the first time. But it was a long ago repressed male desire, against which it was no longer possible for him to behave differently and which, therefore, was spared from destruction. That desire to make the father disappear so that he would stop being a nuisance had to have been born at a time when circumstances were very different, that is, perhaps when the father was not as dear to him as the person sensually desired, or when he himself was not yet capable of a clear and concrete decision, that is, in his early childhood, before he was 6 years old, the date from which his memory already acquired continuity. With this construction the discussion was provisionally closed. In the following session, the 7th, the subject picks up the same topic again. She could not believe that she had ever harbored such a hostile desire for her father. He remembered a novel by Sudermann that had made a profound impression on him, in which a young woman who was watching over her sick sister suddenly wanted her to die so that she could marry her brother-in-law, and then, when her sister was really dead, she committed suicide, convinced that she would die. That after having cherished, even for brief moments, such an ignoble desire, he did not deserve to continue living. The subject understood that resolution and found it very fair that those sad thoughts of his would take him to the grave, since he did not deserve anything else. I made him observe that we psychiatrists know very well that the disease, it gives the sick a certain satisfaction, so that all of them partially resist healing. Therefore, I should not lose sight of the fact that a treatment such as the one we were developing advances in a constant struggle against incessant resistance. He would have more than enough opportunity to remind him of it. The subject now wants to talk about a criminal act in which he does not recognize himself, but which he clearly remembers, and in this regard he quotes an aphorism from Nietzsche: "I have done this," says my memory. "This I cannot have done," says my pride, and remains inexorable. Finally, give up memory. Then he continues, "In this case my memory has not given up. Precisely because to punish yourself you derive pleasure from your reproaches. With my younger brother, to whom I am now very fond, and who precisely these days has me very worried, because he wants to have a wedding that seems absurd to me, and it has already occurred to me more than once to drink the train and murder his girlfriend to prevent him from marrying her. With my younger brother," he said, "I have hit many times as a child. But, nevertheless, we loved each other very much and we were inseparable, although I was intensely jealous of him, because he was stronger and more handsome than me and everyone loved him more. You have already communicated to me such a scene of jealousy motivated by some words from Fräulein Lena. After such an occasion, and surely before I was 8 years old, since I still did not go to school, which I entered shortly after my birthday, I did the following: we had some toy shotguns. I loaded mine with the ramrod, told my brother that if he looked down the barrel he would see something very nice, and when he was looking I fired. The drumstick hit him in the front without doing anything to him, but my intention had been to hurt him a lot. Immediately after firing I fell to the ground, out of my mind, and rolled over, wondering, how could I have done such a thing? But I have done it. I take advantage of the favorable opportunity for my cause. If he had kept in his memory an event so contrary to his true personality, he could no longer deny the possibility that in even earlier years he had done something similar against his father, which today no longer exists. Remember. The subject states that he also remembered other impulses for revenge against that lady with whom he was so in love and of whose character he now develops an enthusiastic description, affirming that it was not easy for him to love and that he reserved it for the one to whom he would one day belong. She didn't love him. When he was sure of his detour, he wove a conscious fantasy in which he became immensely rich, married another, and then paid a visit to his first love in her company to irritate him. But on this point his imagination failed him, for he had to confess that the other woman, in whom he impersonated his wife, was totally indifferent to him. Her thoughts became confused and in the end she only saw clearly that the other had to die. In this fantasy, too, he finds, as in the attack on his brother, the tinge of cowardice that disgusts him so much. In the course of my conversation with him I warn him that, logically, he must consider himself completely irresponsible for such traits of his character, since such reprehensible impulses all come from childhood, corresponding to ramifications of the childish character subsisting in the unconscious, and as he knows very well, it is not possible to attribute an ethical responsibility to the child. From the sum of the dispositions of the child, the ethically responsible man is born in the course of development. But the subject doubts that all his perverse impulses come from such a source, and I promise to prove it to him in the course of treatment. He still alleges that his illness has intensified to a great degree since the death of his father, and on this point I agree with him, as soon as I recognize the sadness caused by the death of his father, as the main source of the intensification of the illness. It is as if sadness had found a pathological expression in illness. Whereas normal mourning lasts a year or two, pathological sadness like yours can be of unlimited duration. This is as far as what I can communicate in detail about this pathological history and in perfect order of succession. It roughly coincides with the exposure of the treatment, which spanned 11 months. Some obsessive ideas and their translation. As is well known, obsessive ideas appear to be unmotivated or absurd, just like the text of our nocturnal dreams, and the first task they pose is to give them a meaning and a place in the individual's mental life, so that they are understandable and even obvious. But in this work of translation we must not allow ourselves to be misled by its apparent insolubility, since the most senseless or extravagant obsessive ideas can be solved by means of adequately deep work. Now, this solution is only reached once the obsessive ideas are related chronologically to the patient's life, that is, investigating when each one of them arose for the first time and in what external circumstances it tends to be repeated. Therefore, when it comes to obsessive ideas whose existence has been brief, which is very frequent, our investigative work is greatly simplified. We can easily convince ourselves that once the discovery of the relationship of the obsessive idea with the patient's life has been achieved, everything enigmatic and interesting that the analyzed pathological product entails becomes immediately accessible to our penetration, that is, its significance, the mechanism of its genesis and its origin from the dominant psychic instinctive forces. I will begin with a particularly transparent example of the impulse to suicide, very frequent in our subject, an impulse the mere exposure of which is almost equivalent to its analysis. Our subject lost a few weeks of study due to the absence of the lady from his thoughts, who had left trip to take care of her sick grandmother. Finding himself zealously devoted to study, it suddenly occurred to him, it is not difficult to fulfill the mandate to present yourself well prepared for the upcoming exams. But what if the decision to cut your throat with the razor was forced upon you? In the act he realized that that decision had just been effectively imposed on him. He went to his closet to get the razor, but then he thought, no, it's not that simple. You have to kill the old woman first who has separated you from your beloved. Terrified before such criminal stimuli, his legs gave way and he fell round to the ground. The relationship of this obsessive idea with the patient's life is already contained in the beginning of his story. His love was absent while he devoted himself with all application to his study, to take the exam as soon as possible and make his marriage with her possible. During the study he was invaded by nostalgia for the absent woman and he thought about the cause of her absence. Then something arose in him that in a normal man would have been limited to a slightly hostile impulse against the sick old woman. It's also annoying that this old woman has fallen ill just at the moment when I so much desire to see my beloved. Something analogous, but much more intense, was what appeared in our patient, an unconscious fit of anger, which, together with the longing for the woman he loved, found its expression in the following exclamation, I would like to go there and murder that woman. Old, who deprives me of the sight of the woman whom I love. Immediately follows the punitive command. Kill yourself to punish yourself for such angry and murderous impulses, and the whole process then penetrates with the most violent affect and in reverse succession, first the punitive commandment and finally the mention of the punishable impulses into the conscience of the patient. I don't think this attempt at an explanation seems forced or involves too many hypothetical elements. Another longer-lasting impulse to vicarious suicide was more difficult to clarify because it was able to hide its relation to the patient's life behind one of those external associations that seem so objectionable to our consciousness. One day, while he was in a summer resort, the idea suddenly arose in his mind that he was too fat and had to lose weight. So he began to leave the table before the last dish was served, to run without a hat through the streets under the hot August sun, and to climb the slopes of the mountain at a gymnastic pace, until fatigue made him stop, bathed in sweat. Behind this mania for losing weight also appeared once, without any veil, the suicidal intention, when, being on the edge of a precipice, the commandment to throw himself to the bottom was imposed on him. The solution to these absurd obsessive acts was later offered to our patient when it suddenly occurred to him that the lady of his thoughts was also in the same summer season in those days, but accompanied by an Englishman, his cousin, who was courting her, inspiring intense jealous of the subject. That cousin was called Ricardo and, according to the general custom in England, he was called Dick. Our patient's homicidal impulses were then directed towards this Dick, of whom he was much more jealous than he himself admitted, and for this reason he imposed the weight loss cure as self-punishment. Although this obsessive impulse seems different from the previous direct suicide command, it shares with it a very important feature, its genesis as a reaction to a violent anger, not fully apprehensible by conscience, against a person who constitutes an obstacle to the subject's love. Other obsessive representations again oriented towards the person of his beloved show different mechanisms and different instinctive origins. During his beloved's stay at her summer residence, the subject produced, in addition to his obsession with losing weight, a whole series of obsessive activities that, at least partially, were related to his loved one. Once when he was sailing with her on a boat, under a violent wind, he had to force her to put on her cap, because the commandment that nothing should happen to her had arisen in it. This was a kind of protective obsession, which produced different acts. Another time, during a storm, he became obsessed with counting to 40 or 50 between lightning and thunder, without knowing at all why he had to do it. The day his beloved left, the subject tripped on a stone in the street and had to push it aside because it occurred to him that, after a few hours, his beloved's car would pass by there and he could trip and overturn on those stones, but minutes later he thought that all this was nonsense, and he had to go back and put the stone back in the place it occupied before in the middle of the street. After his beloved's departure, he was seized by an obsession with understanding, which made his family unbearable, for he forced himself to understand exactly each one of the syllables pronounced by those who addressed him, as if he had otherwise been told. A great treasure will escape him. Consequently, I would ask over and over again, "What did you say?" And when they repeated it to him, he pretended that the first time they had said something else and he remained dissatisfied. All these products of the disease depend on an event that dominated his relations with his beloved at that time. When he said goodbye to her in Vienna at the beginning of the summer, he interpreted a certain phrase of hers to mean that she was trying to deny to the assembled society her friendly relations with him, and this made him feel unhappy. In the summer season he had the opportunity to explain himself to her, and the lady was able to show him that her intention with those words, misinterpreted by him, had been to avoid making a fool of himself. Our subject felt happy again. The obsession to understand alludes directly to this event, presenting itself structured as if the patient had said to himself, after such an experience, you should try not to misinterpret anyone's words if you want to save yourself a lot of useless trouble. But such purpose remains, not only generalized, but also, perhaps because of the absence of the beloved woman, displaced from his person to all the others, much less interesting. The obsession may have arisen from the satisfaction that his beloved's explanations aroused in the subject, but, undoubtedly, it also expresses, at the same time, something different, since it culminates in unpleasant doubts about the exact reproduction of what was heard. The other obsessive commandments put us on the track of this other element. The protective obsession can only mean a reaction remorse and penance against an antithetical impulse, and, therefore, hostile, directed towards the loved person before his explanations. The obsession to tell what had to attack him during the storm is interpreted, with the help of the already accumulated material, as a defensive measure against fears that mean a danger of death. From the analysis of the obsessive representations mentioned above, we already know that our patient's hostile impulses are singularly violent like fits of senseless anger, and we later find that said anger against his beloved continues to seek, after reconciliation, its contributions to obsessive products. In the obsessive doubt of having heard correctly, the doubt, still subsisting, is represented as to whether he has really understood his beloved correctly this time and can justifiably interpret his explanations as proof of affection. A violent combat between love and hate is waged in our lover, both oriented towards the same person, and this combat is plastically represented in the obsessive act, also important as a symbol, of moving the stone out of the way and then annulling that act of love. Taking the dangerous obstacle back to the place it occupied, so that his beloved's car stumbles on it and overturns. We will erroneously interpret this second part of the obsessive act, considering it only as a critical rectification of the pathological activity, which is precisely what he is trying to go through. The fact that it was also carried out under obsessive coercion reveals that it is itself a part of the pathological activity, although conditioned by the antithesis of the motive of its first part. Such two-part obsessive acts, the first part of which is cancelled out by the second, are typical of obsessional neurosis. Naturally, they are misinterpreted by the patient's conscious thought, which provides them with a secondary motivation, rationalizing them. But its true meaning is in the representation of the conflict between two antithetical impulses of approximately equal magnitude and, as far as I know, always of the antithesis of hate and love. They are of special erotic interest because they show us a new type of symptom formation. Instead of finding, as regularly happens in hysteria, a transaction in a single performance, thus killing two birds with one stone, here both elements are satisfied separately, first one and then the other, though not without first carrying out the attempt to establish a kind of logical link between the antagonistic elements, sometimes devoid of all logic. Cf. Hysterical fantasies and their relationship with bisexuality. The conflict between love and hate still found other different expressive means in our patient. At the time when he felt religious again, the obligation to pray was imposed, and the time he devoted to it became longer and longer, lasting up to an hour and a half, because something was always introduced into his prayers that turned them into the opposite. If, for example, he said, "God protect him," the evil spirit would immediately add a no. On one occasion he had the idea of blaspheming, sure that by doing so something would be introduced into his sentences that would turn them into the opposite, an occurrence in which the primitive intention repressed by prayer made its way. In such a hurry, the subject found a way out of abandoning his prayers and replacing them with a brief formula made up of the first letters or the first syllables of different sentences, and he pronounced them so quickly that nothing could get into it. Once he related to me a dream that contained the representation of the same conflict, transferred to my person. My mother had died. The subject wanted to offer his condolences, but was afraid to laugh impertinently when expressing his condolences, something that had happened to him before. So he preferred to leave me a card with the initials PC, Poor Condoler, written on it, but when he wrote them they became PF, Poor Feliciter. The conflict of his feelings towards his beloved was too clear to have escaped his conscious awareness entirely, although from its obsessive manifestations we must deduce that he had no exact idea of the depth of his negative impulses. 10 years before, the lady of his thoughts had rejected his first declaration of love, and from that date the subject alternated between periods in which he believed he loved her intensely and others in which he felt absolute indifference. During the course of treatment, whenever he had to take a step that would bring him closer to the goal of his claims, his resistance usually expressed itself in the conviction that he did not really love her, a conviction that, however, was not long in disappearing. On one occasion when she fell seriously ill, an illness that intensified his interest in her, the subject arose in the desire that such an illness would force her to remain in bed forever. The patient ingeniously interpreted this idea in the sense that if he wanted to see her always sick, it was to free himself from the unbearable anguish caused in him by the thought that once cured he might get sick again. From time to time he occupied his fantasy with daydreams, which he himself recognized as vengeful fantasies and of which he was ashamed. Judging that his beloved placed great value on the social position of her suitors, he fantasized that she had married a man who held an official position. Then a similar position was conferred on him and he rose rapidly, until he was far above the other. One day that man committed a punishable act and his old love threw himself at his feet asking him to save her husband. He promised her and revealed that if he had accepted an official position in his day, it was only out of love for her, since he had foreseen that a time would come when he could be useful to her. Now, once her mission was accomplished, saving her husband, she would immediately resign. In other fantasies, in which he was presented with the opportunity to render an important service to his beloved without her knowing that it was to him that she owed it, the patient recognized only the affection that this woman inspired in him and not the feelings hostile that that affection kept repressed. For the rest, he confessed that on certain occasions he felt clear impulses to cause harm to his beloved. Such impulses generally subsided in her presence and only arose away from her. The precipitating cause of the disease. In one of the treatment sessions, the patient incidentally mentioned an event in which I had to immediately recognize the precipitating reason for the disease, or at least the recent reason for its explosion, which had arisen 6 years ago and has persisted still today. The subject did not have the slightest suspicion of having mentioned something important, nor did he remember having ever attached any value to that event, which, on the other hand, he had never forgotten either. This circumstance calls for a theoretical comment. In hysteria, it is a general rule that the recent reasons for the disease succumb to amnesia, just like the childhood events with the help of which they transform their affective energy into symptoms. In those cases in which total forgetting is impossible, the recent traumatic motive is nevertheless attacked by amnesia and stripped of at least its main elements. In such amnesia we see evidence of a previous repression. Something else generally happens in obsessional neurosis. The infantile premises of neurosis may have succumbed to amnesia, often incomplete, but, instead, the recent reasons for the disease appear preserved in memory. The repression has used a different mechanism here and, in reality, a simpler one. Instead of forgetting the trauma, it has stripped it of its charge of affection, so that only an indifferent and deemed insignificant ideological content remains in consciousness. The difference is in the psychic process that we can build behind such phenomena. But the result is almost the same, since the indifferent memory content is only very rarely reproduced and plays no role in the person's conscious mental activity. In order to differentiate these two forms of repression, we can initially rely on the patient's statement that he experienced the sensation of having always known one and, instead, having forgotten the other for a long time. It is therefore not at all unusual for patients with obsessional neurosis, tormented by self-reproaches and who have linked their affections to wrong motives, to communicate the true ones to the doctor, without suspecting that their reproaches correspond to them, only finding themselves disconnected from them. On these occasions they often exclaim, astonished and even boastful, that this is of no importance to them. This was the case in the first case of obsessional neurosis that many years ago provided me with an understanding of this ailment. The patient, a civil servant who suffered from innumerable worries, called my attention to the fact that, when he paid me the fees for each consultation, he always gave me smooth and clean bank notes. On one of these occasions, I told him, joking, that his status as a public official was revealed in those brand new bills, directly received from the state treasury, and he replied that such bills were by no means new, but that he had the habit of to clean and iron them at home, since it gave him pangs of conscience to give someone dirty bills, in which there must surely have been millions of microbes that could cause serious damage to whoever received them. By then I had already dimly glimpsed the relation of the neuroses to sexual life, and consequently I dared to question the patient about his. His answer was that he did not notice any abnormality in her nor did he feel anything lacking, and he added the following confession: in many houses of the well-to-do bourgeoisie I play the role of a kind old relative and I take advantage of it to invite a girl from time to time. Young man for an excursion in the country, arranging so that we miss the train and have to spend the night out of town. Of course, I take 2 rooms, but when the girl lies down I enter hers and masturbate her with my fingers. And aren't you afraid of doing him some harm by infecting his genitals with your dirty hands? The subject was outraged. What harm am I going to cause them? None of them have felt bad so far, and many of them are now married and continue to treat me. He took my observation very badly and did not return to my office. For my part, I was able to explain to myself his scrupulousness as regards the tickets and his lack of scruple as regards the girls entrusted to his custody by a displacement of affection concomitant with the reproach. The tendency of such a displacement was sufficiently visible. If he left the reproach where it was justified, he had to renounce a sexual satisfaction to which he was undoubtedly driven by energetic infantile determinants. He obtained, then, with such a displacement a considerable advantage. We will have to enter in detail the motivation of our subject's disease. His mother had been educated in the home of a distant relative of hers, the owner of a major industrial company. When he married her, his father entered the service of that company, and their marriage thus gave him a comfortable position. From certain family conversations that the patient had to listen to, he found out that his father had first made court to a beautiful girl from a modest family, some time before he met his mother. After her father's death, her mother told her one day that she had discussed her future with her wealthy relatives, and revealed that one of her cousins had been willing to grant her the hand of her daughter when she finished her studies. The entry into the rich industrial company through that marriage would ensure a brilliant future. Such family plans aroused in him the conflict of whether he should remain faithful to the woman he loved, lacking in fortune, or if he should follow in his father's footsteps by marrying the rich, pretty and distinguished girl that his family destined for him. And this conflict, which in reality was between his love and the will of his father, still alive in him, was resolved by the subject by becoming ill, or rather, he evaded, through illness, the task of resolving it in reality. The proof of this interpretation is found in the fact that the main result of the disease was a persistent inability to work that forced him to delay finishing his studies for a year. Now, that which is shown to us as a result of a disease is but the purpose of it, and its apparent result is, in reality, its cause and motive. Naturally, my explanation was not accepted at first by the subject. He could not believe that the marriage plan could produce such an effect on him, for at the time it had been announced to him it had not made the slightest impression on him. But in the course of treatment he became convinced, by a way singular, of the accuracy of my hypothesis. With the help of a transference fantasy, he lived as present and current something past and forgotten or of which he had not come to be aware. After a very obscure and intricate period of treatment, it was revealed that he had supposed my daughter to a girl whom he had passed one afternoon on the stairs of my house. Having liked that young woman, he imagined that if I was so kind and patient with him, it was because I wanted him for a son-in-law, a fantasy in which he raised the distinction and wealth of my house to the level he desired. But against such a temptation his inextinguishable love for the mistress of his thoughts struggled within him. Once we had managed to overcome a whole series of intense resistances and bitter reproaches, it was impossible for him to escape the convincing effect of the perfect analogy between the fantasized transference and past reality. I will reproduce here one of his dreams from this time to show with an example the style of his representation. He sees my daughter before him, but instead of eyes he has two dung balls. Knowing a little the language of dreams, it is very easy to translate it. The subject is marrying my daughter, not because of her beautiful eyes, but because of her money. The father complex and the solution of the idea of rats. From the motivation of the illness in his adulthood a thread started that led us to our patient's childhood. She was in a situation just as she knew or suspected her father had been before their marriage, and it was thus possible for her to identify with him. In still another way the deceased father intervened in the recent explosion of the disease. The pathological conflict was, in essence, a struggle between the surviving will of the father and the loving inclination of the patient. Recalling the confessions that the subject had made to us in the first treatment sessions, we cannot reject the suspicion that this fight went back a long way, having already begun in his childhood years. By all accounts, the father of our patient had been an excellent man. Before getting married, he had served in the army as a non-commissioned officer, and military life had left behind in him a certain hardness of expression and a great love of the truth. In addition to those virtues that epitaphs usually attribute to all the deceased, he implied an excellent, cordial humor, and an affable kindness towards all his fellow men. This character is certainly not contradicted, but rather completed, by the fact that he used to be violent and easily irritable, a circumstance that earned his children, while they were small and mischievous, sensitive correctives. When the children grew up, the father differed from the others in that he did not. He tried to elevate himself to the status of intangible authority, but revealed to his children, with kindly sincerity, the little faults and blunders of his own life. Surely his son was not exaggerating when he stated that their relationship had been that of two good friends, except on one point. It must have depended on this point that the child thought with undue and unusual intensity about his father's death, that such ideas emerged in the lateral content of his infantile obsessive ideas, and that he came to wish that his father die so that a certain little girl, pitted by his misfortune, show more affectionate with him. There is no doubt that in the field of sexuality there was some difference between the father and the son, nor that the father had come to place himself in front of the precocious sensuality of his son. Years after the father's death, and when the son experienced the pleasure of intercourse for the first time, the idea arose in him that this enjoyment was something so extraordinary that it was worth murdering his father to obtain it. This idea was both an echo and an intensification of his childhood hauntings. A short time before his death, the father had already taken an attitude opposite to the inclination that would later dominate his son. He observed that she was seeking the company of that lady, and advised her to stay away from her, telling her that otherwise she would only make a fool of herself. To these perfectly firm fulcrums another is added when we consider the history of our patient's onanistic sexual activity. In this area, we find a difference of criteria between doctors and patients. The latter are unanimous in considering onanism as the root and source of all their ailments, referring to the masturbation of puberty. Doctors do not know for sure, in general, what judgment to form about it, but influenced by the experience that the majority of normal men also have passed through a period of onanism during puberty, almost all are inclined to consider the manifestations of the sick to be exaggerated. In my opinion, the patients are rather right on this point, since they glimpse something perfectly exact, while the doctors run the risk of neglecting something essential. It is not, of course, in the way that patients understand it, that the almost typical and general onanism of puberty can be held responsible for all neurotic disorders. But such onanism is in reality nothing other than the revival of the onanism of infantile age, hitherto neglected and which reaches its culminating point at 3, 4, or 5 years of age, and this onanism is certainly the most precise manifestation of the sexual constitution of the child, in which we also seek the etiology of subsequent neuroses. Thus, the patients really accuse their infantile sexuality by such an indirect way, and in this they are quite right. On the other hand, the problem of onanism becomes insoluble when one wants to consider the latter as a clinical unit and forgets that it represents the derivation of the most diverse sexual components and the fantasies fed by them. The harmfulness of onanism is only in a very small part autonomous, that is, conditioned by its own nature. Essentially it coincides with the pathogenic significance of sexual life. The fact that so many individuals tolerate onanism without any disturbance, that is, a certain abuse of such an activity, shows us that in them the sexual constitution and the course of the evolutionary processes of sexual life have allowed the exercise of the function under the cultural conditions, while others, due to an unfavorable sexual constitution or developmental disturbance, become ill in their sexuality, that is, they cannot carry out the repression and sublimation of the sexual components without inhibitions and production of substitutes. Our patient's behavior in regard to onanism had been quite singular. He did not develop any onanism at puberty and therefore, according to certain hopes, would have had a right to remain free of all neuroses. Instead, the impulse to masturbate activity appeared in him at the age of 21, shortly after the death of his father. After each such sexual gratification he felt highly ashamed and soon suppressed it entirely. From this moment onanism only reappeared in him on rare and highly singular occasions. Especially in happy moments of his life or under the impression of singularly beautiful passages from his readings. For example, when on a beautiful summer afternoon he heard a postilion playing his hunting trunk with great mastery, until a guard prevented him from continuing because it was forbidden to do so within the city. And again, when reading in Poetry and Truth how the young Goethe, possessed of loving enthusiasm, freed himself from the curse that a jealous woman had cast on the first one to kiss his lips after her. For a long time that curse had superstitiously kept him from kissing any woman, but on that occasion he broke the evil spell that chained him and lovingly kissed his beloved. The same subject was surprised that precisely in those happy and elevated moments of his life he felt compelled to masturbate. But for my part I had to find in those two examples a common element, the prohibition and the fact of violating a mandate. His singular behavior also belongs to the same context in a period in which he was preparing for exams, in which he toyed with the fantasy that his father was still alive and could return to his side at any moment. At that time she managed so that her study hours coincided with the last hours of the night, and between 12 and 1 o'clock she would stop her work, open the door that led to the corridor, as if her father were waiting behind her, and, once back in his room, he would stand in front of the mirror and contemplate his naked penis in it. But this absurd maneuver is understandable considering that he behaved as if he were expecting his father's visit at the traditional hour of the apparitions. During his father's lifetime he had been rather a bad student, which had annoyed and irritated him, and now he wanted to give him the satisfaction that if his spirit returned to earth during those nocturnal hours, it would find him studying. But the other part of his handling could not give the father satisfaction. None. Thus, she challenged him with it and expressed in this way, in an obsessive act that he himself did not understand, the two sides of her behavior towards him, analogously to another later obsessive act already mentioned, in which she removed and put back a stone in the path of his beloved, expressed the two facets of his attitude towards her. Based on these details and other similar ones, I ventured the hypothesis that as a child, around the age of 6, he had committed some sexual offense related to onanism and had been violently punished by his father. This punishment would have put an end, of course, to onanism, but, on the other hand, it would have left in him an inextinguishable grudge against his father and fixed his role as disturber of sexual enjoyment forever. To my great surprise, the patient immediately related to me such an event from his early childhood that had been related to him later by his mother, not having succumbed to oblivion by linking to it singular details. Personally, he did not remember that event at all, which had been related to him by his mother in the following way: when he was still very young, the coincidence of the event with the illness to which his sister, somewhat older than he, succumbed, allowed us to establish the exact date. He must have been guilty of some offense for which his father severely punished him. The punishment would have aroused in him an intense fit of rage, and as his father whipped him he struggled desperately, insulting him furiously. But since he still didn't know any really insulting words, he had thrown at him as such the names of all the objects he knew, calling them a lamp, a towel, a plate, etc. The father, frightened by this violent attack, stopped hitting him and said, "This boy will be a great man or a great criminal." The subject is of the opinion that the impression of the scene lasted a long time in both him and his father. The latter did not hit him again, and he, for his part, derives from such an event a large part of the transformation of his character, because, fearful of the magnitude that his anger could reach, he had become a coward ever since. On the other hand, throughout his life he had been terrified of being beaten, and when one of his brothers was punished in such a way, he always hid in fear and indignation. A new investigation near his mother sought, in addition to the confirmation of this story, the detail that at that time the subject was between 3 and 4 years old and that he had deserved the punishment for having bitten someone. The mother did not remember more details, and although she did not dare to assure it, she believed that the person bitten by the child had been the nanny in charge of his custody. From his words it could not be deduced that the child crime had had the slightest sexual nature. Transferring the discussion of this childhood scene to the note, we will state that its emergence was initially moved by the patient's refusal to accept the existence of a childishly acquired and later latent hostility against his beloved father. For my part, I had hoped that it would produce a stronger effect on him, since this event had also been related to him so frequently by his father himself that there could be no doubt of its accuracy. But with that ability to dispense with logic that always surprises us so much in acutely intelligent obsessive neurotics, the subject continued to oppose. The probative force of that story was the fact that he himself did not remember that event at all. Thus, in order to reach the conviction that his attitude towards his father required this unconscious compliment, he had to go through the painful path of transference. It didn't take long for him to grossly insult me and all my loved ones in their dreams, daytime fantasies, and occurrences, while intentionally never showing me anything but the greatest respect. When in treatment sessions he communicated such insults to me, his attitude was that of a desperate man. How is it possible that you consent to let yourself be insulted by a despicable man like me? You must throw me out of your house. I don't deserve anything else. On these occasions he used to get up from the divan and pace around the room, a behavior that at first he motivated with fine sensitivity, stating that it was impossible for him to lie comfortably while saying those enormities. But it didn't take him long to find the exact explanation for himself, that is, he got up to get away from me, afraid that I would hit him. When he sat down he behaved like someone trying, in real panic, to evade a violent correction. He put his hands to his head, covered his face with his arms, leaned back with his face contorted painfully, etc. He remembered that his father was easily irritable and that in his violence he sometimes did not know how far he could go. In such a painful school he gradually acquired the conviction that he lacked and that any other subject not personally interested would have acquired on the spot, thus also leaving the way open for the solution of the idea of rats. At this culminating point of the cure, a large amount of material, retained until then, emerged, which already allowed a total vision of the case. As I already had to announce, the exposition of this material must be extremely brief and synthetic. The first enigma that confronted us was why the two interventions by the captain, the story of the torment of the rats and the invitation to return the money to Lieutenant A, had produced such intense excitement in the subject and provoked in him such pathological reactions. Violent. It was to be supposed that we were dealing here with a case of complex sensitivity and that such reports had wounded hyperesthetic points of his unconscious. So it had happened, indeed. As always when he came into contact with military life, the subject was in full unconscious identification with his father, who had served in the army for several years and used to recount many anecdotes from that time. Chance, which helps in the production of symptoms such as the literal meaning of a word in jokes, allowed one of the father's little adventures to have a common element with the captain's invitation. The father had once lost, playing cards, spilrat, a small sum entrusted to him as a non-commissioned officer, and he would have had a hard time if a comrade had not lent it to him. When he left the army and reached a comfortable position, he looked for the kind comrade to pay him back that money, but he could not find him. Our patient did not know for sure if he had made the desired restitution. The memory of this youthful lack of his father was painful to him, since his unconscious was full of hostile doubts about its qualities. The captain's words, "You have to return Lieutenant A the 3.80 crowns, rang in his ears as an allusion to his father's unpaid debt. Instead, the news that Z.'s post office clerk had supplied the money, flatteringly expressing her confidence in him, even though she did not know him, intensified her identification with her father in another quarter. He then thought that the pretty daughter of the innkeeper from the small town where the post office was located had been very kind to the young officers, and he proposed to return there at the end of the maneuvers to try his luck with the beautiful girl. But now that young woman found a rival in the post office employee. The subject could thus, like his father in the days before his marriage, vacillate between two girls without knowing which of them he would devote his attentions to at the end of his military service. We now suddenly notice that his singular indecision as to whether he should head for Vienna or return to the town where the post office was located, and his constant attempts to get off the train and take another in the opposite direction, are not as insane as they first seemed to us. To his conscious thought, the attraction of the town where the post office is located appeared motivated by the need to fulfill his oath there, with the help of Lieutenant A. In fact, what attracted him to that place was the postal worker, for whom Lieutenant A was only an easy substitute, since he had stayed in the same locality and had personally taken care of the military postal service. When the patient later found out that Lieutenant A had not been in charge of such a service, but Lieutenant B, he also included the latter in his combination, and was then able to repeat his vacillations between the two officers in his delusions concerning the two officers. Girls that he judged favorable to his person. In the clarification of the effects produced by the account that the captain gave him of the torment of the rats, we will have to follow more closely the course of the analysis. First, an extraordinary amount of associative material emerged, without the situation of the obsessive product becoming more transparent for the moment. The idea of the rat's torment had excited a whole series of instincts and aroused a multitude of memories, the rats thus acquiring, in the brief interval between the captain's story and his warning that he must return the money, a whole series of symbolic meanings, to which many others were added in the future. My exposition of all this can only be very incomplete. The torment of the rats awakened above all the anal eroticism that had played an important role in the subject's childhood, having been maintained through whole years by the itching caused by the worms. The rats thus acquired the significance of money, a relationship that was shown in the association raten, times, to ratten, rats. The subject even made a real scroll out of the rats for his personal use. For example, when questioned by him, I told him the amount of my fees for each treatment session. The association that arose in him to my words was, so many florins, so many rats, an association that only 6 months later he came to communicate to me. To this language gradually translated the entire economic complex linked to his father's inheritance. That is, all the ideas belonging to such a complex were incorporated into the obsession with the help of the association rats terms and submitted to the unconscious. This financial significance of the rats was also supported by the captain's invitation to return the amount of the postal shipment with the help of the Spill Rat Association, from which we found access to the father's youthful absence. The rat was also known to him as a carrier of dangerous infections and could therefore be used as a symbol of the fear of syphilitic infection, so justified during military service, behind which all kinds of doubts about conduct were hidden. Of the father during his life in the army. In another sense, the same penis was also a carrier of the syphilitic infection, and in this way the rat became a genital organ, a significance to which it could still aspire due to a different circumstance. The penis, and especially that of a small child, can be described as a worm, and in the captain's account the rats passed through the anus as in the subject's infant years their intestinal parasites. In this way, the penile significance of the rats rested once again on anal eroticism. The rat is also a disgusting animal that feeds on excrement and lives in the sewers through which the detritus runs. It is somewhat superfluous to indicate how widely the rat delusion was made capable by means of this new meaning. The association so many rats so many florins could be considered, for example, as the exact definition of a female profession that he found extremely repugnant. On the other hand, it is perhaps not indifferent that the substitution of the penis for the rat in the captain's story provoked in him the idea of a situation of per annum sexual commerce that, referred to his father and the woman he loved, would have seemed singularly repulsive to him. The fact that such a situation arose again in the obsessive threat that arose in him after the captain's invitation to return the 3.80 crowns to Lieutenant Z clearly reminds us of a certain insult widely used among the South Slavs and that we can find reproduced in the Anthropophyteia, by F.S. Krauss. All of this material and some more was interpolated, with the covered association regarding marriage, Eraten, in the context of rats. The fact that the story of the torment of the rats had to arouse in our patient all the prematurely repressed egotistical and sadistic impulses is attested by his own story and by his mimicry in developing it. But, despite all this rich material, the meaning of his obsessive idea was not clarified until one day the woman of the rats emerged among his associations, from Ibsen's Little Eyolf, already making the conclusion inevitable that in many of the forms of his obsessive delusions about rats also had the significance of children. In investigating the genesis of this new meaning, we immediately stumble upon the oldest and most important roots. On a visit to his father's grave, he had seen an animal that he thought was a rat cross rapidly over it. He immediately assumed that he had come out of his father's grave and had just satiated his hunger on the corpse. Inseparable from the representation of the rat is the detail that it gnaws and bites with sharp teeth. But the rat is not dirty, gluttonous, and aggressive without punishment, because as the subject had witnessed many times with horror, it is cruelly persecuted and killed by man. Many times he had felt compassion for those poor rats. But he himself had been a dirty and disgusting little animal who bit others in his fits of rage and was violently punished for it. Thus he really found his match in the rat. Fate threw him in this way, in the captain's story, a stimulus word from a complex, and the subject did not stop reacting to it with his obsessive idea. So the rats were children, according to their first and most important experiences. And at this point he communicated something that he had long kept out of context, but which now made completely clear his interest in children. The woman he had loved for so many years without being able to decide to marry her had had both ovaries removed and was therefore condemned to sterility. Such was really the cause of his indecision, for he was extraordinarily fond of children. Only then did it become possible for us to unravel the impenetrable process of the formation of his obsessive idea. With the help of childhood sexual theories and symbolism that is already known to us from the interpretation of dreams, we managed to translate everything with full meaning. When during that break, at the end of which the subject missed his glasses, the captain told him about the torment of the rats, he was only impressed by the cruelly libidinous nature of the imagined situation. But immediately the relationship was established with that childhood scene in which he himself had bitten someone. He substituted the father for the captain capable of upholding such punishments and placed a part of the emerging rancor on himself, who had by then rebelled against his father's cruelty. The incidentally arising idea that such a thing could happen to the person he loved would have to be translated by the following optional impulse: it is to you that something similar should happen to you, an impulse directed against the captain, but behind him and against his father. When later, a day and a half later, the captain handed him the postal package addressed to him and warned him that he had to return the 3.80 crowns of the reimbursement to Lieutenant A, the subject already knew that his cruel superior was wrong and that only the post office employee should be grateful for the advance. A mocking and aggressive response against the captain was about to take place in him: "Yes, I'll give them back when the frogs grow hair," an answer which, naturally, he had to withhold. But arising from the paternal complex stimulated in the meantime and from the memory of the repeated childhood scene, the answer that was formed was the following: "Yes, I will return the money to Lieutenant A when my father or my girlfriend have children." Or this other one: "It is as certain that I will return the money as that my father and my girlfriend can have children." This is a mocking statement tied to an absurd and unrealizable condition. But in this way he had already committed the crime of mocking the two people who were dearest to him, his father and his beloved. Such a crime demanded a punishment, and this consisted of imposing an oath impossible to fulfill and that strictly obeyed the law. Erroneous invitation from his superior: "Now you really have to pay Lieutenant A the money back." Seized with convulsive obedience, he repressed his full knowledge that the captain was basing his invitation on an erroneous premise: "Yes, you have to return the money to Lieutenant A, as the person representing your father has ordered. Your father can't be wrong. Neither can a king make a mistake, and when he challenges a subject with a title that does not correspond to him, it is that he already grants it forever." His conscience does not come to have more than a very vague notice of this process, but the rebellion against the captain's command and its transformation into the opposite are also represented in it. First, you must not return the money, otherwise it will not happen. The punishment of the rats. And then, the antithetical oath as punishment for the rebellion. Let us still picture to ourselves the constellation in which the formation of the great obsessive idea took place. The subject was libidinously predisposed by his long abstinence and by the friendly welcome that women always give to young officers. In addition, when leaving maneuvers he was somewhat upset with his beloved. Such heightened libido prompted him to resume his old struggle against his father's authority and even to think of sexual gratification with other women. Doubts as to his father's qualities and indecision as to the value of the woman he loved were also intensified. In such a state of mind he allowed himself to be drawn into insulting them both, and then punished himself for it. When, at the end of the maneuvers, he hesitated for so long between leaving for Vienna or staying and fulfilling his oath, he did nothing but represent in a single conflict the two that had always been involved, whether or not he should obey his father and that of whether or not he was to remain faithful to his beloved. One more word on the interpretation of the content of the sanction. If not, both will suffer the torment of rats. This sanction rests on two infantile sexual theories, of which we have already spoken elsewhere. The first of these theories is that children are born through the anus, and the second follows logically from this possibility that men can also have children like women. According to the technical rules of the interpretation of dreams, the fact of emerging through the anus can be represented by the opposite fact of penetrating the anus, as in the punishment of rats, and vice versa. It is not possible to expect, for such serious obsessive ideas, simpler solutions, nor to achieve them by different means. With the solution that the analysis provided us, the delirium of the rats vanished. Theoretical part. Some general characteristics of obsessive products. In 1896 we defined obsessive representations as transformed reproaches that returned from repression and always referred to a sexual act performed with pleasure in childhood years. This definition seems debatable today in terms of its form, although it integrates exact elements. It tended too much towards unity and took as its model the process of obsessional neurotics themselves, who, with their peculiar tendency towards indeterminacy, regard the most diverse psychic products in a unitary way as obsessional representations. It is really more correct to speak of a obsessive thought and to emphasize that obsessive products can be equivalent to very different psychic acts, and can be determined as desires, temptations, impulses, reflections, doubts, commands, and prohibitions. In general, patients have a tendency to vanish such determination and to present as an obsessive representation the content stripped of its index of affection. In one of the first sessions of the treatment, our patient offered us an example of such an elaboration of a wish aimed at reducing it to the quality of mere mental association. It must also be recognized that up to now the phenomenology of obsessive thinking has not been able to be studied in any detail. In the secondary defense that the patient develops against the obsessive representations that have entered his consciousness, products arise that deserve a special name. Remember, for example, the series of ideas that occupied our patient during his return from the maneuvers. They are not purely reasonable reflections that the subject opposes to his obsessive ideas, but something like mixed products of both forms of thought. They take certain premises of the obsession with which they have fought and place themselves, with the means of reason, in the field of pathological thought. In my opinion, such products deserve the name delusions. An example that readers should interpolate into the appropriate place in the case history will make such a differentiation completely clear. When our patient carried out for a whole season the foolish behaviors that we instead describe, prolonging the study until late at night, opening the door of his room at the stroke of 12 to allow his father's spirit to enter, then standing before the looking at his genitals in the mirror, he tried to put that obsession away from him, thinking about what his father would say if he really were still alive. But this argument had no effect whatsoever as long as it was put in this reasonable way. The obsession ceased only when the subject integrated the same idea in the form of a delusional threat, telling himself that if he continued such nonsense, something bad would happen to his father in the afterlife. The value of the differentiation justified, of course, between primary and secondary defenses, however, unexpectedly diminished by the discovery that patients do not know the verbal text of their own obsessive representations. This statement seems paradoxical, but it makes perfect sense. In effect, during the course of a psychoanalysis, not only the courage of the sick is intensified, but also that of their illness, which ventures to more precise externalizations. It happens as if the patient, who until then fearfully avoided the perception of his pathological products, now devoted his attention to them and experienced them more clearly and clearly. In detail. By two special paths we can also arrive at a more precise knowledge of obsessive products. In the first place, we realize that dreams can offer us the authentic text of the obsessive product, which has only been made known to us in waking life mutilated and distorted, as in a poorly worded telegram. Such texts appear in the dream as oral manifestations, contrary to the general rule that the words contained in dreams always come from those pronounced or heard by the subject during the day. Secondly, the analytical investigation of a pathological history leads us to the conviction that, frequently, several successive obsessive ideas, but with different literal texts, are, basically, one and the same. The obsessive idea has fortunately been rejected for the first time and then returns deformed, no longer being recognized and thus being able to offer more defense resistance. But the exact form is the primitive one, which often shows its meaning without any veil. When, after painful labor, we succeed in clearing up an incomprehensible obsessive idea, no, it is rare to hear the patient say that before the emergence of the obsessive idea itself, an idea, a temptation, or a desire arose in him, such as the ones he is now experiencing. We expose, but which immediately disappeared from his imagination. Unfortunately, the exposition of the examples of this kind integrated in the history of our subject would demand a place that we do not have in the present study. So, the obsessive representation that we could describe as official integrates in the deformation suffered with respect to its primitive text the traces of the primary defense. Its distortion makes it viable, since conscious thought is forced to misinterpret it in the same way as it interprets the manifest dream content, which is the product of compromise and distortion and is misinterpreted by waking thought. Such an erroneous interpretation by conscious thought can be verified not only in the obsessive ideas themselves, but also in the products of secondary defense, for example, in protective formulas, a fact of which we can present two good examples here. Our patient used as a defensive formula the word aber, but, quickly pronounced and accompanied by a gesture of revulsion, and in one of the treatment sessions he later stated that said formula had undergone a change in recent times, since he no longer said aber, but aber. Questioned by me about the reason for that transformation, he indicated that the unstressed E of the second syllable did not offer him the slightest guarantee against the feared appearance of something alien and contradictory, which is why he had decided to accentuate it. This explanation, corresponding entirely to the style of obsessional neurosis, however, proved to be inaccurate, constituting, at best, a rationalization. In reality, when he pronounced aber, what he was doing was assimilating said word to that of abwehr, defense, whose psychoanalytic significance was known to him from our theoretical conversations about treatment. Thus, the treatment had been used in an abusive and delusional way to strengthen a defense formula. He told me again. His main magic word, formed by him, to protect himself against temptations, with the initials of the most effective prayers, and to which he added a fervent Amen. But it is not possible for me to transcribe said word here, because when the patient revealed it to me I immediately observed that it was nothing more than an anagram of the name of the lady of his thoughts. Such a name contained an S that the subject placed at the end and immediately in front of the Amen added, thus forming the word semen, seed, semen. We can therefore say that he had reunited his semen with the woman he loved, that is, that he had masturbated thinking of her. But he himself had not observed such an obvious relationship, and the defense had allowed itself to be fooled by what was repressed. This is also an excellent example of that rule according to which the elements that have to be rejected end up penetrating that for which they are rejected. Once we have established that the obsessive ideas have undergone a distortion, just like the dream ideas before becoming the content of the dream, we will be interested in finding out the technique of such distortion, and nothing would prevent us from exposing here the different means of the same in a series of obsessive ideas translated and interpreted. But neither can we give more than a few samples. Not all of our patients' obsessional ideas were as complicated and difficult to interpret as the one about rat torment. In others, a very simple technique had been used, that of distortion by omission, ellipsis dash, which provides such an excellent help in the production of jokes and which also fulfilled its duty here as a defensive means against understanding. One of his oldest obsessive ideas, equivalent to a warning or an admonition, was, for example, the following: if I marry the woman I love, misfortune will happen to my father, in the afterlife. If we now interpolate the omitted intermediate elements discovered in the analysis, we obtain the following thought process: if my father lived, my intention to marry that woman would make him as angry as in that past childhood scene, so that I too would be angry again against him and wish him terrible ills, that the omnipotence of my desires would inevitably fall on him. Here is another case of elliptical elaboration of an ascetic warning or prohibition. He had a little niece whom he loved very much. One day the following idea arose in him: if you allow yourself to have intercourse once more, a misfortune will happen to little Ella, she will die. Interpolating what has been omitted, results in the following process: in all intercourse, even with venal personnel, you have to think that, if you get married, the sexual intercourse with your wife will never result in the birth of a child, due to the sterility of his beloved. This will hurt you so much that it will make you envy your sister for her little Ella, and your envy will lead to the death of the girl. Ellipsis, as a deforming technique, seems to be typical of obsessional neurosis, and for my part I have also found it in the obsessional ideas of other patients. Above all, I remember a particularly transparent and interesting case of doubt for presenting a certain analogy with the structure of the representation of rats. It was about a lady who suffered, above all, from obsessive acts. She was walking with her husband through the city of Nuremberg and entered a store with him where she bought various objects for her daughter, including a comb. The husband, who was bored by these purchases, told her that he had seen before, in the window of an antique dealer, some coins that interested him. She would go, then, to buy them and then return to pick her up at that store. His wife found his absence too prolonged, and then, when she returned to ask him where he had stayed and he said that it was precisely in the antiques shop, she was assailed by the tormenting doubt as to whether she had not always owned that same comb that he had bought for his daughter. Naturally, the subject could not discover the simple relationship between such an obsessive idea and the prolonged absence of her husband, but we immediately see that it is a question of a displaced doubt, and we can complete its unconscious mental process in the following way: if I am to believe that you have only been in the antique shop, I can also believe that I have had many years this comb that I just bought. We find ourselves, then, before an ironic and mocking comparison, analogous to the mental process of our patient before the captain's warning: yes, it is just as certain that I will return the money to Lieutenant A as that my father and my beloved can have children. In the lady of our example, the doubt depended on her unconscious jealousy, which made her suppose that her husband had taken advantage of the interval for a gallant visit. For this time we will not undertake the psychological study of obsessive thought, although it would surely provide us with valuable results and would contribute to the clarification of our knowledge of the essence of the conscious and the unconscious more than the study of hysteria and hypnotic phenomena. It would be highly desirable that philosophers and psychologists who develop ingenious theories of the unconscious, based on what they know only by hearsay or on their own conventional definitions, would directly study the phenomena of obsessive thinking, a study from which they would draw decisive insights. Such prior study could even be required of them if it were not much more painful than the working methods to which they generally adhere. For my part, I will limit myself to pointing out that even in obsessional neurosis, unconscious mental processes occasionally arise in consciousness in a pure and undistorted form, and that such an interruption can have its starting point in the most different stages of the unconscious mental process. And that obsessive representations can almost all be recognized, at the moment of eruption, as existing products of a long time ago. Hence the singular phenomenon that when investigating the first emergence of an obsessive idea in a neurotic subject, he himself is forced to move it further and further back in the course of the analysis, always finding new primary motivations for it. Some psychic peculiarities of obsessive neurotics: their attitudes towards reality, superstition, and death. I propose to study here some mental characteristics of patients with obsessional neurosis, which do not seem important in themselves, but which help us to understand something very important. These characteristics showed strong relief in my patient, but I know very well that they are not to be attributed to his individuality, but to his suffering, and that they are peculiar in a way quite typical of other obsessional neurotics. Our patient was superstitious to a great degree, although he was a man of acute intelligence and wide culture, and he sometimes claimed to take no notice of such nonsense. He was, then, superstitious, and at the same time he was not, thus differentiating himself, distinctly, from the uneducated superstitious who feel perfectly in accordance with their absurd beliefs. He seemed to understand that his superstition depended on his obsessive thinking, although at times he was totally identified with it. That behavior so contradictory and oscillating only seemed to admit a certain explanation. I did not hesitate, then, to suppose that the subject possessed, with respect to such questions, two different and opposed convictions, and not just an indeterminate opinion. He oscillated, then, between these two convictions, and his decision depended absolutely on his attitude at the moment towards his neurosis. As soon as he had mastered an obsession, his credulity was mocked, and nothing happened to him that could superstitiously worry him, but as soon as he returned to find himself under the domination of an obsession not yet resolved or what is the same, a resistance all kinds of singular accidents began to occur to him that supported his superstitious conviction. In any case, our patient's superstition was that of a cultured man who dispensed with old age, such as the fear of Fridays, the number 13, and so on. But he believed in omens and prophetic dreams. He always bumped into those people whom moments before he had thought of without knowing why, and he received letters from others whom he had remembered hours before, after a long time of not having cared for anything of them. With all this, he was honest enough, or rather, faithful enough to his official convictions, not to forget those other cases in which very intense premonitions had not been confirmed, such as the time when he went out for the summer with the certainty that he was not I would return to Vienna alive. He also recognized that the vast majority of omens referred to things of no importance to him, and that when he met an acquaintance whom he had thought of only moments before, after long oblivion, such an encounter would not have any singular consequences. And he confessed that everything important in his life had happened without any omen announcing it, for example, the death of his father. But all these arguments did not modify in any way the discord of his convictions and only demonstrated the obsessive character of his superstition, already deducible from his oscillations of identical meaning to those of resistance. I was not, of course, in a position to explain rationally all his marvelous past stories, but as for those that occurred during the course of the treatment, I was able to show him that he himself collaborated in the fabrication of such miracles, and I managed to make him see the means that he used in such work. Such means were indirect vision and reading, forgetting and, above all, memory errors. In the end, he himself helped me discover the little tricks with which he produced such miracles. As an extremely interesting childhood root of his faith in premonitions and omens, we once discovered the memory that his mother, when it was a question of fixing the date of something future, used to say, "This or that day I won't be able to, because I will have to stay in bed." And, indeed, she always spent such dates lying down. There is no doubt that the subject felt the need to find in his experiences such points of support for his superstition, and that for this reason he observed so attentively the current inexplicable coincidences of daily life, and when those were not enough, he randomly helped with his activity. Unconscious. In many other obsessional neurotics I have found such a need again, and I suspect its existence in almost all of them. It seems to me clearly explicable by the very psychological character of obsessional neurosis. As we have already explained before, in this disturbance, repression is not produced through amnesia, but through the destruction of causal relationships through the suppression of affects. These repressed relationships seem to retain a certain admonitory energy to which we have elsewhere compared to an endopsychic perception, thus being able to be incorporated into the external world, that is, projected onto it as testimony to the repressed psychic. Another psychic need common to obsessive neurotics, which entails a certain affinity with the previous one, and whose investigation leads us very deeply into the investigation of instincts, is the need for insecurity or doubt. The creation of insecurity is one of the methods that neurosis uses to extract the patient from reality and isolate him from the world, a tendency integrated in all psychoneurotic disturbances. The sick make an evident effort to evade all security and to be able to remain in doubt. This tendency sometimes manifests itself in an antipathy to watches, which ensure, at least, the determination of the time, and in skillful unconscious maneuvers aimed at rendering such instruments useless, making doubt impossible. Our patient showed special skill in avoiding all information that could lead him to a solution to his conflict. Thus, he was completely unaware of the most important circumstances in his beloved's life, and he claimed to be ignorant of the name of the doctor who had operated on her and whether the operation had been limited to a single ovary or had included both. The predilection that obsessive neurotics show for insecurity and doubt constitutes for them a reason to preferentially adhere their thoughts to those subjects in which insecurity is generally human and in which our knowledge or our judgment remain necessarily exposed to doubt. Such topics are, above all, paternity, the duration of life, survival in the afterlife, and memory, to which we tend to attest without having the slightest guarantee of its accuracy. Obsessional neurosis makes extensive use of such insecurity of memory for the production of symptoms. We will soon see what role the duration of life and survival in the afterlife play in the thinking of patients. Before, and as an adequate transition, we will examine that superstitious trait of our patient, which surely will have aroused singular surprise in the reader to find it mentioned in previous pages. I refer to the omnipotence he claimed of his ideas and feelings and of his good and bad desires. There is certainly no small temptation to consider such an idea as a delusion that goes beyond the limits of obsessional neurosis, but for my part I have again found the same conviction in another obsessional neurotic, who has long since completely recovered, and who behaves normally, and in fact all obsessional neurotics behave as if they shared this conviction. We will try, therefore, to clarify such an exaggeration. Assuming, therefore, that in such a belief a piece of the primitive infantile mania for greatness is honestly manifested, we asked our patient on what he based his conviction, and the subject answered us by referring to two events in his life. When he went for the second time to that spa in which he had previously found relief from his ailment, he asked for the same room that he had occupied the first time, and whose situation had favored his interviews with one of the nurses. But they told him that that room was already occupied by an old professor, and at this news, which so considerably diminished his hopes of relief, he reacted with the following words, "May he be struck by lightning." 15 days later he woke up with the sensation of having a corpse near him, and when he got up he later found out that the professor had indeed died, struck by lightning, and that his corpse had been brought into the room at the very hour he had left. Woken up. The other event referred to a girl older than him and with intense sexual needs, who on one occasion had clearly courted him, even going so far as to ask him if he couldn't love her a little. The subject had responded negatively, and a few days later he learned that the girl had thrown herself off a balcony. Then he reproached himself for his sullen conduct, telling himself that it had been in his hands to preserve that life if only he showed the girl a little affection. It was in this way that he came to acquire the conviction of the omnipotence of his love and his hate. Without denying the omnipotence of love, we will emphasize that in both cases it is about death, and we will accept the immediate explanation that if our patient is forced, like other obsessive neurotics, to exaggerate the effect of his hostile feelings on the external world is because a large part of their internal psychic effect escapes their conscious awareness. His love, or rather his hate, is really powerful, for it creates precisely those obsessive ideas whose origin the subject does not understand and against which he defends himself in vain. Our patient showed a most peculiar relationship with the theme of death. He cordially condoled all the deaths and went to all the burials, to the point that his brothers made fun of him, telling him that he was like crows, but, in addition, he continuously killed his acquaintances in his fantasy to be able to express his cordial condolences to the survivors. The death of an older sister, which occurred between the ages of 3 and 4, played a very important role in his fantasies and is closely related to his childhood misdeeds of those years. We also know how precociously the idea of his father's death troubled him, and we must consider his illness itself as a reaction to such an event, obsessively desired 15 years earlier. The singular extension of his obsessive fears to the afterlife is nothing but a compensation for those death wishes against his father. It emerged when the sadness caused by his father's death was renewed a year and a half later, and he tended, against reality and the desire that had previously manifested itself in all kinds of fantasies, to deny and annul his father's death. The expression in the afterlife appears frequently translated by the same subject in the words "if my father lived." But also the behavior of many other obsessional neurotics, to whom fate has not imposed a first encounter with the phenomenon of death in such early years, is nevertheless very similar to that of our patient. His thoughts are incessantly occupied with the duration of life and the possible death of other people, and his superstitious tendencies originally had no other content and perhaps, in general, no other source. But, above all, they need the possibility of death to resolve the conflicts that they leave unresolved. Its essential character is that of being incapable of any decision, especially in matters of love. They indefinitely postpone any resolution and, constantly penetrated by the doubt of by which person or by which measure against a person, they have their model in that old German court, whose lawsuits always ended because the disputing parties died before they had obtained a sentence. In this way, in every vital conflict, the death of an important person, and almost always loved by them, was in wait, be it their father or mother, a rival or one of the love objects among which their inclination oscillates. But with this study of the death complex in obsessional neurosis we already penetrate into the instinctual life of obsessional neurotics, which we are now going to deal with. The instinctual life of obsessional neurotics and the origins of compulsion and doubt. If we want to get to know the psychic forces whose struggle has generated this neurosis, we will have to return to what our patient's analysis tells us. Discovered as to the reasons for his illness in adulthood and in childhood. The subject became ill at the age of 20, when faced with the temptation of marrying a woman other than the one he had been loving for so long, and he dodged the resolution of such a conflict by delaying compliance with the conditions, to the extent that it depended on him. Prior to its emergence, for which neurosis provided the means. The vacillation between the beloved woman and the other can be reduced to the conflict between the influence of the father and the fidelity of his beloved, that is, to the choice between the father and the sexual object, as, according to his memories and his obsessive associations, he had already developed in his early childhood. In addition, in all the details of his life it was clearly visible that, as for his beloved as for his father, there was a struggle between love and hate in him. His vengeful fantasies and obsessive phenomena, such as the obsession to understand or the act of removing a stone from the road and putting it back, testify to the existence of this struggle, normally understandable to a certain degree, since the beloved woman had given him reasons for hostility with his first rejection and his subsequent coldness. But in his relations with his father, too, this duality prevailed, as the translation of his obsessive ideas revealed to us, and his father must also have given him reasons for hostility in his childhood, as analysis later almost certainly showed. His relationship with the woman he loved, a mixture of affection and hostility, fell for the most part under his conscious awareness. The more he deceived himself as to the magnitude and externalization of his negative feelings. Instead, his hostility against the father, which had once been intensely conscious, now lay long repressed, and only against his most intense resistance could it be brought back to consciousness. In the repression of the infantile hatred against the father we have to see the process that forced the entire subsequent event to enter the framework of the neurosis. These sentimental conflicts of our patient are not independent of each other, but are welded together in pairs. The hatred against his beloved had to be added to his adherence to the father, and vice versa. but the two opposing currents subsisting after the simplification, that is, the struggle between the father and the beloved and the antithesis of love and hate existing in the subject's relationship with each of these persons, have nothing to do with each other. Neither for its content nor for its genesis. The first of the two conflicts corresponds to the normal hesitation between man and woman as objects of loving choice, a hesitation that is provoked in the child for the first time with the famous habitual question, "Who do you love more, mom or dad?" and which then accompanies him throughout his life, despite all the individual differences in terms of the intensity of feelings and the fixation of definitive sexual goals. But this opposition soon loses, normally, its character of a dilemma, making possible the simultaneous satisfaction of the unequal demands of its two terms, although also in the normal man the higher esteem of one of the sexes always happens at the expense of the other. The other conflict seems stranger to us, that is, the one that develops between love and hate. We know that the beginning of falling in love is often perceived as hate, and that love that finds satisfaction denied easily turns into hate, and poets assure us that in stormy stages of falling in love, both feelings can subsist juxtaposed, as in a competition. Contradictory. But we are amazed to find a chronic juxtaposition of love and hate, both very intense and directed towards the same person. We would have expected love to have dominated hate or been devoured by it. Actually, such subsistence of opposites is only possible under special psychological conditions and with the collaboration of the unconscious. Love has not been able to extinguish hate, but only to reject it to the unconscious, a psychic instance in which it is safe from the action of conscience and can subsist without any decline and even grow. In such circumstances, conscious love usually reaches, in turn, by reaction, special intensity to be able to constantly and tirelessly carry out the task of keeping its opponent in repression. This unique constellation of love life seems to have its condition in a very early dissociation, which occurred in the prehistoric childhood period, of the two antithetical elements, with repression of one of them, generally hatred. The review of a series of analyses of obsessional neurotics gives us the impression that this relationship given in our patient between love and hate constitutes one of the most frequent and manifest characteristics of obsessional neurosis and, consequently, one of the most frequent. Important. But, although it would be very attractive to be able to refer the problem of the choice of neuroses to the instinctive life, we have sufficient reasons to avoid such a temptation, and we must remember that in all neuroses we discover the same instincts as substrates of the symptoms. Repressed. In addition, the hatred that love keeps repressed in the unconscious also plays a very important role in the pathogenesis of hysteria and paranoia. We do not know enough about the essence of love to feel precise affirmations here. Above all, the relationship of its negative factor with the sadistic component of the libido is still completely unknown to us. Only by way of provisional information we will observe that in the cases of unconscious hatred investigated by us it was shown that the sadistic component of love had constitutionally integrated a high intensity and, consequently, had been the object of a premature and too fundamental repression, thus resulting that the observed neurotic phenomena were derived, on the one hand, from conscious love intensified by reaction, and on the other, from sadism that continued to act in the unconscious as hate. But however this singular relation of hate and love is to be interpreted, its existence is undoubtedly demonstrated by our patient's analysis, and it is very satisfying to see how comprehensible the enigmatic processes of obsessional neuroses become to us in when we refer them to such a factor. If against an intense love raises a hatred almost as intense as it, the immediate consequence must be a partial paralysis of the will, an inability to adopt any resolution regarding all those acts whose motive must be love. But, moreover, such indecision does not remain limited for long to a single group of acts, for what acts of a lover are not related to his main motive? Furthermore, sexual behavior carries a prototypical power with which it acts on the other reactions of man, modifying them, and, finally, the psychological character of obsessional neurosis typically tends to make the greatest possible use of the displacement mechanism. Consequently, the indecision gradually extends to all the activity of the subject. With this, the regime of obsession and doubt is established, as it is shown to us in the mental life of obsessive neurotics. Doubt corresponds to the internal perception of indecision that seizes the patient, as a result of the inhibition of love by hate, as soon as he intends to perform some act. He doubts, in reality, his own love, which should have been for him, subjectively, the safest, and this doubt spreads over everything else, moving preferentially over the most trivial and indifferent. He who doubts his love has to doubt everything else, less important. This is the same doubt that in protective measures causes the insecurity of the subject and forces them to repeat them over and over again to vanish it, finally making such acts of defense as unrealizable as the primitively inhibited amorous resolution. Early in my investigations I had to accept another more general derivation of the insecurity of obsessional neurotics, a derivation which seemed more easily adapted to the norm. Indeed, when we are writing a letter and someone asks us one or more questions in the meantime, we later feel a justifiable insecurity as to what we have written while they were speaking to us, and we are forced to reread the letter once it is finished. I therefore assumed that the insecurity of obsessional neurotics, for example, in their prayers, arose from the fact that while they prayed they were incessantly disturbed by unconscious fantasies. This hypothesis was already accurate and is easily reconcilable with the preceding statements. It is true that the insecurity of having carried out a protective measure comes from disturbing unconscious fantasies, but such fantasies also contain precisely the contradictory impulse that was to be rejected by the sentence. This is evident in our patient on an occasion in which the disturbance does not remain unconscious, but is expressed out loud. When she wants to pray, saying God protect her, a sudden no hostile, and the subject guesses that it is a piece of a curse. If that no had remained silent, the subject would have continued in a state of insecurity and would have prolonged his prayers more and more, but as soon as he heard it, he suppressed them altogether. Before doing so he had tried, like other obsessional neurotics, all kinds of methods to avoid the appearance of the contradictory element, shortening his sentences or reciting them very quickly. But all these techniques fail sooner or later. Early, and as soon as the loving impulse has managed to accomplish something, after moving on an indifferent act, it is followed by the hostile impulse that strives to annul its work. When the obsessive neurotic later comes to realize the insecurity of memory, he generally manages to extend, with its help, doubt, even to acts already performed, which lacked any relation to the complex of love and hate, and to everything else. His past. Remember the example of that lady who had just bought a comb for her daughter and who, when she was attacked by a jealous suspicion against her husband, immediately began to doubt whether that comb had not been hers forever. It is as if he openly said, "If I can doubt your love," and this was just a projection of her doubts about her own love for her husband, "I can doubt everything," thus revealing the hidden meaning of neurotic doubt. But the obsession is an attempt to compensate for the doubt and rectify the unbearable state of inhibition to which it testifies. When, at last, and with the help of displacement, the patient manages to bring the inhibited purpose to a resolution, such purpose must be compulsorily carried out. It is no longer, of course, the original, but the stagnant energy does not give up the opportunity to find an outlet in the act of substitution. It is expressed, then, in commands and prohibitions, alternating the loving impulse and the hostile one in the conquest of the path leading to the derivation. The tension that arises when the obsessive commandment should not be executed is intolerable, and the subject perceives it in the form of intense anguish. But the very path that leads to a substitutionary act displaced on a minutiae is so hotly contested that said act can only be carried out, in most cases, as a measure of protection and in close contact with one of the impulses that are to be carried out. Be rejected. A kind of regression also replaces the final resolution with preparatory acts. The thought replaces the action, and in any previous mental stage of the same it is imposed, with obsessive power, instead of the substitute act. Depending on whether this regression from act to thought is more or less marked, the case of obsessional neurosis takes the character of obsessive thinking, obsessive representation, or of obsessive action in the strict sense. These obsessive acts proper are only made possible by a kind of reconciliation of the two conflicting drives taking place in them, through the formation of transactional products. The obsessive acts approximate, in effect, more and with greater precision, the longer the disease lasts, to infantile sexual acts similar to onanism. The subject thus comes to carry out, in this form of neurosis, acts of love, but only with the help of a new regression, and no longer oriented towards a person, towards the object of love and hate, but autoerotic acts, as in childhood. The first regression from action to thought is favored by another of the factors involved in the genesis of neurosis. In the case histories of patients we regularly find the early emergence and premature repression of the visual sexual instinct and knowledge, which also regulates in our patient a whole part of his infantile sexual activity. We have already pointed out the participation of sadistic components in the genesis of obsessive neurosis. In those subjects in whose constitution the instinct to know predominates, the capital symptom of neurosis is always obsessive brooding. Mental activity itself remains sexualized, since sexual pleasure, usually referred to the content of thought, falls on the intellectual process, and the satisfaction achieved by reaching a mental result is felt as sexual satisfaction. This relationship of the instinct to know with the mental processes makes it especially appropriate for attracting to thought, in the various forms of obsessional neurosis in which it participates, the energy that tries in vain to break through to action, where it offers itself the possibility of a different kind of satisfaction. In this way, the substitute act can be replaced, in turn, with the help of the instinct to know, by preparatory mental acts. Postponement of action soon finds a substitute for delay of thought, and the whole process is transported, with all its peculiarities, to a new terrain. With the help of the foregoing deductions we can perhaps already venture to determine the long-sought psychological character which lends the products of obsessional neurosis their obsessional quality. Obsessive are those mental processes that, as a consequence of the antithetic inhibition in the motor end of the mental systems, are undertaken with a qualitative and quantitative development of energy destined only, habitually, for action, that is, those thoughts that have to represent, regressively, acts. I do not believe that there will be serious contradictions in the hypothesis that habitually, and for economic reasons, thought is driven by means of smaller displacements of energy than those dedicated to acts destined to derivate and modify the external world. What bursts into consciousness with plenty of energy as an obsessive idea must then be guaranteed against the destructive action of conscious thought. We already know that such protection is achieved through the distortion that the obsessive idea has undergone before becoming conscious. But this is not the only means. Only very rarely is it omitted to remove the obsessive idea from the situation that it presided over in genesis, and in which it would be easily accessible to understanding, despite its distortion. For this purpose, on the one hand, an interval between the pathogenic situation and the subsequent obsessive idea is created, an interval that misleads the causal investigation of conscious thought, and on the other, the content of the obsessive idea is detached from its relations. Individuals by means of a generalization. Our patient's obsession with comprehension offers us an example of this order, and perhaps another better one, a patient who forbade herself to wear any jewelry, although the motivation referred to a single jewel that the subject had envied her mother and hoped to inherit from her. Lastly, the obsessive idea is also protected against conscious solution work by its indeterminate or equivocal verbal expression. Such verbal expression, wrong interpreted, it can then be incorporated into the delusions, and the successive developments or substitutions of the obsession would be linked to the error of interpretation and not to the authentic text. But it can be observed that such delusions constantly tend to establish new relations with the content and the verbal text of the obsession not received in conscious thought. For a single observation we will return again to the instinctual life of obsessional neurosis. Our patient also proved to be a renifleur, olfactory. According to his own statements, During his childhood he knew people by smell, like a dog, and olfactory perception still had greater significance for him today than for others. I have also observed something similar in other patients, obsessional neurotics or hysterics, and have learned to take into account the part played in the genesis of neuroses by repressed sexual olfactory pleasure in childhood. In general, the question can be raised as to whether the decrease in the sense of smell suffered when man moves his face away from the ground and the subsequent organically conditioned repression of olfactory pleasure do not play a significant part in man's training for neurotic diseases. This would explain how it is that the increase of civilization demands more and more extensive repressions of the sexual life. It is well known what an intimate relationship exists in the zoological organization between the sexual instinct and the function of the organ of smell. In closing, I will express the hope that my papers, incomplete in all respects, will prompt other researchers to further study obsessional neurosis with the aim of making new discoveries. In my opinion, what is characteristic of this neurosis, what distinguishes it from hysteria, is not to be sought in the instinctual life, but in the psychological circumstances. I cannot leave my patient without registering my impression that he was dissociated into 3 personalities, 1 unconscious and 2 preconscious, between which his consciousness could oscillate. His unconscious integrated the early repressed violent and perverse impulses. In his normal state he was a kind, cheerful, reflective, intelligent and clear-headed man, but in a third psychic organization he worshipped superstition and asceticism, in such a way that it could imply 2 convictions and 2 conceptions of the universe. This preconscious personality involved, above all, the products of the reaction to his repressed desires, and it was not difficult to foresee that, had the illness been prolonged, it would have ended up devouring the normal personality. I have now been given the opportunity to investigate such phenomena in a patient seriously ill with obsessional neurosis and similarly dissociated into a tolerant and serene personality and another gloomy and ascetic. The subject presents the first of such personalities as her official self, but lives dominated by the second. Both psychic organizations have access to her consciousness, and behind her ascetic personality lies her unconscious, totally unknown to her and made up of ancient long repressed desires. End. Analysis of a case of obsessive neurosis, case of the rat man. Sigmund Freud.